In the dim glow of the forge, the rhythmic clang of hammer meeting anvil echoed softly, a steady heartbeat in the otherwise still cavern where Hephaestus toiled endlessly. The god of fire and metal, known more for his quiet persistence than for any grandiose display, labored hour after hour beneath the volcanic mountain that sheltered his workshop, a place both hidden from the eyes of Olympus and alive with a slow, deliberate hum of creation. Sparks flew like tiny stars bursting briefly in the air, only to be swallowed again by the dark walls scarred with soot and ancient runes. The heat was constant, wrapping the space in a gentle, unyielding embrace that neither comforted nor oppressed, but simply was, as essential as the breath that filled Hephaestus's lungs and the steady beat of his steady heart. Outside, the world spun in its usual chaos with gods and mortals alike, caught in the rush of fate and fortune, but here time moved differently. Minutes and hours stretched and folded into one another as the craftsman shaped metals, bending stubborn, iron and molten bronze into tools and treasures, small and large, meant to serve gods and men alike. His hands, scarred and calloused, moved with practiced grace, each strike measured and precise, never hurried, never lacking in care, as if the act of creation itself was a slow meditation, a sacred ritual performed in solitude. Occasionally he paused to study his work, eyes sharp despite the creeping weariness, seeking the perfect balance between strength and beauty, function and form. Around him, the faint glow of embers flickered like gentle breathing, casting shadows that danced along the walls as if the very stones joined in silent reverence to the god's enduring craft. Though his limbs ached and sweat traced quiet paths down his brow, Hephaestus remained steadfast, for this was his purpose: to transform raw elements into something more, to give shape to dreams forged in fire and hammered by time. And so the day passed, and the next, measured not by the sun's travel or the songs of birds, but by the steady music of hammer and flame. A timeless lullaby for a god whose patience was as enduring as the metals he shaped. As the forge's steady glow continued to pulse softly in the quiet cavern, Hephaestus's thoughts wandered beyond the immediate task of shaping metal, drifting toward the vastness of the world outside his workshop, where gods mingled and mortals toiled unaware of the divine hands shaping their destinies. In this refuge beneath the earth, far from the celestial squabbles and grandiose displays of power, Hephaestus found a certain calm, a place where the eternal pressures of Olympus could not reach him, where the only demand was the slow, patient transformation of raw ore into purpose. He worked not for glory or praise, but for the satisfaction of mastery itself, the quiet joy of turning chaos into order, fire into form. The metals he coaxed into life carried stories, shields to protect, heroes, delicate jewelry to adorn the divine, mechanisms that hummed with hidden power. Each piece bore the imprint of his labor, a testament to hours of relentless dedication, sweat mingling with soot and ash, forging a bond between creator and creation. Occasionally, his thoughts returned to the gifts he had fashioned for others, such as the unbreakable chains that held Prometheus or the golden thrones that lined the halls of Olympus, reminders that even a god's work could carry weight far beyond the physical. Yet, despite the grand significance of some commissions, Hephaestus remained humble in his routine, embracing the slow passage of time as an ally rather than a foe. Around him, the cavern breathed with the quiet hiss of cooling metal and the occasional crackle of flames licking at the edges of the forge, sounds that blended into a steady, soothing cadence. Outside, the day lengthened and shortened, seasons shifted unnoticed, but within this sanctuary of fire and stone, the only measure was the rhythm of hammer blows and the glow of molten rivers flowing between hardened rock. There was no rush, no frantic urgency, only the deliberate unfolding of effort, the kind that stretched hour after hour, steady as the beat of a drum deep within the earth. In this space, Hephaestus found a kind of peace, not in stillness but in motion, the ceaseless dance between heat and metal that defined his existence. Here, the world's noise faded into background hum, and all that mattered was the slow, quiet progress of the work itself, a craft so ancient and steady it seemed woven into the very fabric of the earth. Deeper into the cavern, where fewer sparks reached and the air held a denser warmth, Hephaestus moved with the same unwavering pace, carrying a length of glowing bronze with iron tongs, its radiant orange hue pulsating gently like a sleeping heart freshly stirred. He laid it carefully on the anvil, and as he raised his hammer once more, the sound resumed, not harsh but firm and dependable, like the ticking of a great slow clock. Each strike was deliberate, not only shaping metal, but also carving time itself into quiet moments of labor and reflection. The hours stretched again, but Hephaestus paid them little mind. His sense of time had long ago slipped away from the sunlit world, replaced by the inner rhythm of his work. The cavern, alive in its own way, watched silently as he crafted, the walls bearing witness to centuries of toil, their surfaces dark and rippled from past eruptions and eruptions of thought alike. On stone shelves and along wooden racks, half-completed projects waited patiently. Blades with no hilts, gears without their housing, shields that had yet to meet the battlefield, each a promise paused in the act of becoming. Occasionally, he would step back and study one of these abandoned pieces, not with disappointment but with a quiet curiosity, as if wondering not if he would finish it, but when the right moment would call him back to it. The silence of the forge was not absolute. Soft clinks, low murmurs of flame, the shuffle of sandals against stone, all blended into a gentle background score, unchanging and comforting. Hephaestus, though a god, felt no need to impose his will forcefully upon the world. Instead, his creations unfolded like long, patient thoughts, considered, balanced, purposeful. From time to time he paused to adjust the bellows, and with a measured motion, he summoned more breath into the fire, watching as the flame brightened and danced more fiercely before settling once again into its constant, steady roar. The air thickened slightly, perfumed with the scent of hot metal, smoke, and the faint trace of old olive oil used to temper tools long forgotten. His face, illuminated by firelight and streaked with soot, showed no urgency, only calm resolve. Even the imperfections in the work, the slight curves that resisted symmetry, the tiny bubbles in cooled bronze, were accepted without frustration, for they reminded him that all things, divine or mortal, bore the marks of their making. He worked on, the hours lengthening behind him like a trail of warm coals, each footstep guided by the memory of repetition, every movement familiar, yet meaningful. No one came to visit him here, not even the gods, and he preferred it so. This solitude was not a punishment, it was a sanctuary. While Olympus blazed with pride and conflict, this hollow in the mountain offered only quiet, heat, and the comfort of tasks that never rushed, never demanded spectacle, only completion. And so, again and again, the hammer rose and fell, and Hephaestus remained at the center of his own quiet cosmos, an island of endurance amid the endless tide of divine drama. Far above the cavern where Hephaestus labored, the golden halls of Olympus gleamed under the brilliance of an eternal sun. But none of that radiance reached the warm gloom of the forge, where the god of fire moved without haste, his every motion steeped in focus and familiarity. Today, or what passed for a day in this timeless realm, he turned his attention to a quieter task, the delicate creation of tiny mechanical birds, artworks of bronze and silver, built not to serve but simply to exist, to flutter and chirp in quiet corners of gardens long imagined but never planted. Hephaestus bent low over his workbench, a broad slab of stone smoothed by centuries of use, his strong hands now wielding tools of exquisite finesse, pincers, wire hooks, chisels with tips as fine as hair. These miniature marvels, no larger than a curled fig leaf, took shape under his care, each wing feather a sliver of bronze so thin it shimmered when it caught the light, each tiny eye a dot of obsidian no wider than a grain of sand. The gears that turned within them were secrets only he understood, whirring not with magic but with the quiet logic of balance and pressure and coil. As he worked, his face relaxed into something close to contentment, his furrowed brow smoothing, his breathing slowing in a way that suggested not boredom, but peace. This was not labor in the ordinary sense. It was more like listening to a soft, familiar melody and gently humming along. The forge, though filled with fire and iron, was not always a place of heat and clangor. Sometimes it was as gentle as a breath in the dark, as thoughtful as an old story told by a dying flame. The mechanical birds, when complete, would never fly far nor sing loudly. They were not meant for Olympus or for admiration, but simply to perch in a quiet place, their beaks still, their tiny wings folded, waiting. Perhaps someday Aphrodite would find one among the ivy and smile faintly, or a passing breeze would stir their feathered frames and coax from them a nearly inaudible hum, like a forgotten lullaby. But for now, they remained in the forge, nested among scraps of gold and curls of copper shavings. As Hephaestus wound another spring, his thoughts wandered again, not toward Olympus, nor to the stories of gods and betrayal and exile that had once colored his life with pain, but to a memory of quiet waves breaking against black volcanic rocks. His first memory, perhaps, before he even had a name. It was strange how the rhythm of creation could lead him backward, not only through memories but through feelings, textures, half-felt shapes in the dark that only work could summon. A soft creak came from one of the ceiling beams, a reminder that the mountain above was still alive, its slow breath mingling with his own, and the warm smell of heated bronze filled the air like incense. The mechanical bird on the bench blinked once, just once, a trick of a hinge, and he smiled slightly, though no one was there to see. The fire behind him pulsed again, steady and low, and he reached for another gear without thinking, as if the motion were guided not by choice but by harmony. There was no need to speak, no need to rush, no fear of silence. The forge held everything it needed: fire, metal, time, and the god who understood how to wait. The hours had deepened into something indistinct, as though the concept of time itself had grown weary and decided to recline quietly in a shadowed corner of the forge, letting the rhythm of Hephaestus's hands take over all measurement. In this eternal dusk lit by glowing coals and flickering tongues of flame, the god of the forge now shifted from his smaller mechanical works to something more formidable, a great circular shield, one meant not for war, but for ritual, to be mounted in the halls of a lesser temple where sunlight rarely touched, but where incense was burned with care. He chose a thick disk of bronze that had been cooling in the corner, its surface mottled like the skin of an aging olive, and set it upon a low, wide anvil that had borne the weight of many such tasks. As he brushed away the fine dust and examined the blank canvas, he did not plan with drawings or maps. Instead, he let the design come to him in the slow, unfolding way a tree grows, unhurried, natural, inevitable. With a smaller hammer and a series of precise engraving tools, he began to etch scenes into the bronze, not of heroic battles or thunderous gods, but of quiet things: farmers sowing seed under the watchful gaze of the moon, a mother spinning, wool beside a fig tree, a boy asleep beside his shepherd dog under the shade of an old cypress. These images came not from stories told on Olympus, but from Hephaestus's rare glimpses into the world of mortals, moments he had caught in fragments, reflected in polished armor, whispered by smoke drifting up from village hearths, or sensed through the deep hum of the earth itself. He worked slowly, each figure formed with the kind of delicate pressure one might use to stroke a sleeping animal, careful not to push too hard, not to rush the metal's acceptance of form. From time to time, he would pause, not because he was tired, but because even the god of the forge respected the rhythm of breath and stillness. The fire behind him dimmed slightly, letting the shadows stretch farther, longer, as though they were leaning in to see the scene unfold. And still, he worked. A tiny lamb nestled near its mother took shape on the lower quadrant of the shield. Above it, the outline of a distant mountain range emerged. Not any specific peak, but the idea of a mountain, quiet and unmoving, the kind that exists in dreams or remembered stories. No detail was rushed. Even the texture of the soil beneath. A farmer's sandal was gently teased from the bronze. A subtle line here, a soft indentation there. Hephaestus didn't consider whether anyone would truly study the shield closely enough to see these details. It didn't matter. The act of making was the reward, and within that act was all the serenity he needed. Occasionally he leaned back and rotated the shield slightly, testing how the light of the forge kissed the etched lines, watching as tiny shadows played within the grooves, giving motion to stillness. It pleased him in a quiet way, like the sound of rain falling on stone far away. The shield would eventually leave the forge to be hung in a dim hall, where pilgrims whispered prayers and burnt offerings in silence, unaware of the God who had shaped the scenes they barely noticed. But that too was fine. Creation did not demand recognition. It asked only to be allowed. The air thickened slightly with the scent of aged bronze and faint ash, and a single ember drifted upward, glowing, spinning, then fading into nothing. Hephaestus continued his work, the weight of the shield anchoring him not just to the anvil, but to a world of simple stories, patiently preserved in metal, waiting to be seen or forgotten. There came a moment in the forge, a quiet pause between one task and the next, when Hephaestus simply stood still, his hands resting on the edge of the workbench, his eyes not fixed on any particular thing, but softened with the calm blankness that only comes after long, uninterrupted labor. The air around him shimmered faintly with the residual warmth of dying embers, and in that moment of silence, even the forge itself seemed to exhale. His body, though divine, bore all the signs of endless toil. A slight limp in one leg that he never minded. Burn marks scattered across his arms like constellations, and calluses so thick they had become like a second skin. He was not beautiful by the standards of the other gods, nor did he care to be. His beauty lived in the things he shaped, not in the flesh that shaped them. Slowly, he reached for a heavy cloth and wiped the sweat and soot from his brow. Each pass of the fabric a meditative motion, like smoothing the surface of a still pond. Around him, the tools of his trade waited patiently. Pliers, awls, hammers of every size, fine chisels arranged in rows like an orchestra silent between notes. He surveyed them not with urgency, but with familiarity, as one might look over a garden before deciding which part to tend next. Choosing a simple iron rod, he placed it on the work table and began to twist it slowly using a heated clamp, shaping it into the form of a spiral. No function, no commission, just a shape he liked, made for the sake of the motion itself. The metal bent and cooled. He considered how even purposeless things had value in the act of being made, how the labor of hands could bring form to a thought that had no destination. The spiral reminded him of smoke rising from a cooking fire in a mortal home, of the way ivy curls up stone columns, of the patterns left in sand by retreating waves. There was no flame roaring now, no hiss of quenching, only the soft groan of metal slowly yielding and the faint creak of leather straps as he moved. Outside, though he hadn't seen the sky in what felt like ages, he imagined the sun tracing its course, unseen and unneeded here. The forge knew no hours, no dawn or dusk. It answered only to the steady demands of intention and time. Behind him, in the shallows of the forge's darker corner, sat a large, dust-covered crate, filled with fragments of half-formed ideas, incomplete statues, malformed hinges, cracked goblets, and once, even a helmet designed to whisper thoughts into its wearer's mind, abandoned when he found it too eager to speak. These were not failures in his eyes, merely pauses, things that would wait until he felt their story return. He passed the twisted iron to a shelf, letting it cool fully, and turned toward the crate. Pulling out a tarnished gear, he turned it, over in his hands, remembering a time when he had begun a design for a self-turning sundial. Pointless in this sunless space, yet compelling in its contradiction. The idea still tugged at him gently like a loose thread at the hem of a robe. Perhaps he would return to it. Perhaps not. Either way, he placed the gear beside the workbench and sat down on a low stone bench worn smooth by centuries of use. He rested there without shame or pretense, his shoulders sloping slightly forward, his head bowed not from fatigue but from reverie. In the heart of the mountain, where no voices intruded and no footsteps echoed but his own, Hephaestus let the quiet wrap around him like a second forge, a forge of stillness, of contemplation, of dreams slowly cooling into form. Time drifted softly onward in the forge, not as a march but as a slow unfolding, like parchment unrolling under its own weight. And Hephaestus, feeling no urge to resume with force, allowed the weight of this calm to settle upon him. The silence was not empty but full of the memory of sparks, the lingering warmth of flame, the invisible echoes of tools put down with care. He sat on his bench, unmoving, his gaze resting on a shallow basin of water used for cooling metal. The surface, still and reflective in the dim firelight, it shimmered faintly with the orange and gold flickers of the forge behind him. And for a while, he let his mind settle into the mirror-like calm of that simple bowl. In it, he did not see the gods or Olympus, or the faces of those who had once mocked his limp or dismissed his quiet nature. Instead, he saw the movement of his own breath, the curl of steam rising from his skin, the shapes of his forge stretching gently across water's surface like the way dreams stretch across sleep. Without moving, he began to shape his next idea, not with tools, but within thought. It was to be a box, no larger than a satchel, with sides made of polished bronze and inlays of smoky quartz, not for Pandora, not for trickery or trap, but simply a vessel meant to hold something ordinary, perhaps a lock of hair, a feather, a note written by a mortal hand. There was beauty, he believed, in the idea of something divine made for a quiet, human purpose. When at last he rose, it was without strain, his body moving as if guided by the rhythm of the forge itself, the way a bird takes flight not because it must, but because it feels the wind has become right, and has become right. He walked to the corner where his store of materials sat piled in careful stacks, flat sheets of bronze, rods of copper, lumps of unshaped silver, bits of gemstone and marble tucked into soft cloth. He chose slowly, letting his fingers trace across the cold surfaces, each texture familiar as a well-worn melody. As he carried his selections back to the bench, he passed a great bellows and gave it a gentle pump, awakening the fire just enough for it to whisper back to life, a soft glow returning to the stones as if the forge itself were sighing awake from slumber. Hephaestus prepared the bronze first, heating it with care, ensuring it softened just enough to be malleable without losing its integrity. The smell of metal warmed again, mingling with the older scent of ash and leather, and as he began to fold the bronze into fine panels, he thought about mortals and how they built boxes of wood or clay, tucking away precious tokens of memory, things that had no use but which somehow felt sacred because of the feelings attached to them. Perhaps this box would be forgotten someday, buried in a ruined city, unearthed by wandering hands centuries from now. Or perhaps it would never leave this forge, sitting quietly on a shelf beside other creations that waited without impatience. Either outcome was acceptable. The act of making for Hephaestus was never wasted, even if the world never saw the result. He soldered the edges of the panels together with careful heat, fusing them so cleanly that no seam remained, just a smooth, quiet surface that held within it the intention of stillness, of safekeeping. As the metal cooled, he embedded the quartz along the lid, 3 thin strips evenly spaced, not symmetrical but balanced the way he preferred. The fire behind him dimmed again, not extinguished, but content to glow softly, and the box now lay finished before him, plain yet complete, shining dully in the forge's flicker. Hephaestus did not smile, nor sigh, nor speak. He simply placed it beside the twisted spiral from earlier and returned to his seat. Another small act of creation had passed into the world, slow and silent like the falling of ash upon still earth. The forge never truly slept, and neither did Hephaestus in the way mortals understood sleep. For even in his moments of rest, some part of him remained tuned to the quiet murmurs of flame and metal, like a musician who continues to hear notes long after the song has ended. As the low, pulsing warmth of the forge hummed softly through the stone, he sat quietly, his gaze drifting across the room where shadows leaned like old friends, long and familiar. Outside, the world continued in its endless whirl. Gods clashed, mortals dreamed, storms gathered, lovers whispered beneath the stars, but none of it reached here. This place was set apart, anchored deep within the belly of the mountain, where thoughts cooled slowly, and time was more suggestion than law. It was in this moment of absolute stillness that a new idea began to shape itself, not something born of commission or divine need, but an old, half-remembered design, long left, untouched in the margins of his mind. It was a kind of lantern, not one that simply held light, but one that mimicked the rhythm of fireflies, pulsing gently, unpredictably, like breathing, like thought. He had once glimpsed such lights while watching mortal children chase them across summer fields, their laughter echoing faintly through the veil between worlds. That moment had never left him, not because it was grand, but because it was quiet. Now, centuries later, it returned to him, not with urgency but with soft insistence. Rising slowly, Hephaestus moved toward a high shelf where forgotten sketches and parts rested, wrapped in cloth and dust. He pulled down a long-stemmed vessel of thin copper, slightly warped from age, and turned it over in his hands. The shape pleased him, round at the base, narrowing at the neck, like a seed pod, waiting to bloom. He brought it to the bench, where he cleaned its surface with slow circular motions using a cloth soaked in oil and memory. Once clean, he fitted it with a fine glass globe, one he had blown himself ages ago when the mood for glasswork had seized him for a season. Into the base he inserted a small mechanism, 3 copper arms, a winding spring, and a rotating disc punctured with pin-sized holes, each cut to mimic the flight path of an insect's gentle dance. As he assembled it, his hands worked without thought, guided by the kind of deep memory that lives not in the mind but in the body, in the fingers, in the small muscles of the wrist and palm. When the lantern was finished, he placed it at the edge of the bench and dimmed the forge behind him, letting the cavern fall into near darkness. Then with the lightest touch, he wound the small dial at its base. The glass globe flickered once, then again, and soon it began to glow with a slow, irregular pulse, soft golden light blooming and fading like the breath of a sleeping creature. It filled the room not with brilliance but with presence, a warmth that invited stillness, the kind of light that made one want to pause, to remember, to listen. Hephaestus watched it for a long while, unmoving. This was not the kind of work that would be praised in Olympus, nor sought by kings, nor etched into temple stone. But to him, it was perfect. The kind of creation that asked nothing and gave everything. He placed it on a shelf beside the bronze box and the spiral, and returned to the fire to let it glow gently once more. Behind him, the lantern continued to pulse, filling the forge with a rhythm that no god demanded, and no mortal expected, a silent offering to the forgotten wonder of simple things done well, done slowly, and done with love. As the flickering lantern continued its soft, breathing glow from the shadowed shelf, casting moving light across the stone walls like ripples across quiet water, Hephaestus turned his attention toward the far side of the forge, where older projects rested beneath cloth covers, their shapes long undisturbed, their purposes once urgent but now faded into the background hum of the forge's memory. One such shape caught his eye, a larger form draped in thick woolen fabric darkened by soot and time. With slow, deliberate movements he approached it and lifted the cloth away, revealing the smooth metallic outline of a seated figure, a partially completed automaton meant to mimic human form, crafted not to deceive or entertain, but to simply sit, to listen, to be present. It had no face yet, just a curved dome where features might have been, and its body was jointed with brass hinges designed to move slowly, as if weighed by thought rather than urgency. Hephaestus had begun this creation during a time of silence, when even the forge's fire had seemed quiet and distant, and he had imagined building something that could remain unchanged, untouched, yet full of quiet company. Something that could keep him from speaking only to the fire and his tools. Now, after many seasons had passed, he found himself drawn back to it, not with renewed ambition, but with the slow, thoughtful attention one gives to a long-lost letter rediscovered in a drawer. He examined the joints, gently oiled the hinges, and adjusted the curve of the spine to allow the figure to lean ever so slightly forward, as if listening to a story only it could hear. There was no need to rush. The figure would never walk, never speak, never carry messages for the gods. Its purpose was subtler, to hold stillness, to reflect the calm endurance of its maker. He fitted the fingers next, fine copper digits, each etched with spiral patterns to echo the shapes of smoke and time, and positioned the hands upon its knees, palms open and relaxed. With a small, near-invisible gear inserted behind its chest plate, the figure could breathe, not with air, but With motion, a soft rise and fall designed to echo the rhythm of a sleeping being, Hephaestus watched as the mechanism began to turn slowly, and with it the shoulders lifted and fell, the head tilted ever so slightly to one side, and the entire sculpture took on the impression of quiet patience. It was not a god, nor a mockery of one. It was not human, but neither was it empty. It was instead a vessel of waiting. Waiting without demand, without sorrow, without expectation. He stepped back and let the forge grow quiet again. The only sound now the subtle click of the automaton's breath, a rhythm so gentle it seemed to exist more in the imagination than in the air. As he sat once more upon his bench, Hephaestus regarded it not as a creation to be admired, but as a companion in silence. It did not speak, but it did not need to. In a world filled with the voices of thunder and prophecy, of desire and command, this one still form reminded him that there was power in stillness, in being rather than doing. The light from the lantern caught on the figure's curved limbs, and for a moment, they shimmered like water under moonlight. The forge, now filled with a sense of quiet presence, seemed almost to expand, not with space, but with peace. Hephaestus closed his eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to listen, to the breath of the automaton, to the whisper of the flame, and to the silence between those sounds that needed no explanation. And in that moment, the god of fire was not alone, not in the way that matters, because the forge and all it held breathed with him. As the slow rhythmic breath of the automaton continued beside him, its subtle movements blending into the natural stillness of the forge like a background harmony, Hephaestus reached for a fresh piece of marble, its surface cool and untouched, the color a soft blend of ivory and pale ash, reminiscent of clouded skies or worn parchment. This stone had sat among his supplies for years, perhaps centuries, waiting not for the right moment but for the right mood, a difference subtle enough that only one who lived outside the noise of Olympus could feel it. There was something meditative in the first touch of chisel to stone, something that asked for presence but not precision, for calm but not calculation. He did not intend to sculpt a likeness of a god or beast or hero. Those things belonged to temples and storytellers. What emerged instead under the slow scrape of his chisel was the shape of a sleeping bird, wings folded tightly against its sides, head tucked gently beneath one wing as if caught in eternal rest. There was no grandeur in its form, no outstretched toes, no illusion of flight, only the deep quiet of something at peace. As marble dust settled into the grooves of the stone floor and clung to his forearms like snow, Hephaestus worked without thought of completion. The bird would be small enough to sit in the palm, not meant for display or worship, but perhaps to be held, to be understood through touch rather than sight. The forge was nearly silent now, the fire reduced to a bed of coals that glowed dimly, giving the room a softness that daytime never offered. The lantern still pulsed faintly on the shelf nearby, its glow flickering across the stone walls, catching the chisel's edge now and then, and turning it briefly to gold. With each motion, Hephaestus shaved away more of the world, revealing, beneath the marble's surface, not a masterpiece, but a feeling, a memory perhaps of birds that once nested in the quiet corners of mortal homes, or the stillness just before dawn, when all creatures rest. His fingers moved slower now, not from fatigue but from reverence, understanding that the final moments of shaping were the most delicate, where form and meaning converged. As the sculpture neared its end, he smoothed the curve of the wings with a soft cloth, brushing away the remaining dust, revealing the stone's hidden warmth beneath its cool outer shell. He set the finished bird upon a small block of driftwood he had kept from an earlier project, the grain of the wood wrapping the bird like a cradle, as if the sea itself had once carried it to shore. There was something sacred in its simplicity, a purity untouched by divine ambition or mortal need. Hephaestus stepped back and watched it rest, and in its stillness, he recognized a reflection of his own quiet existence, constant, patient, uncelebrated. This forge, this cavern of heat and silence and time, was a place where things like this could be made and simply left to be, without purpose beyond the act of being. The sleeping bird joined the lantern, the box, the spiral, and the automaton, in a growing collection of unnoticed wonders, a silent museum for no audience, a chorus of quiet things created without command. He poured a small ladle of water onto the coals, and a soft hiss rose like a sigh from the earth itself. The warmth didn't leave the room, it merely settled deeper, wrapping around stone and metal like a blanket. He returned to his bench and stretched his legs, his gaze flicking from one creation to the next. Not with pride, but with the deep contentment of someone who had listened well to the silence and answered with care. And as he leaned his head against the stone wall behind him, eyes half-lidded, breath steady, Hephaestus let the quiet hold him the way only silence earned through labor can hold a soul. And the forge breathed with him once more. With the forge, resting in that soft in-between glow, where flame had given way to coal and the shadows had grown thicker and deeper like a woolen cloak around the stone walls, Hephaestus reached once again for a piece of work long left untouched, a delicate, bronze lyre that had sat unfinished on a high shelf, its frame half-formed, the strings missing, the tuning arms uncarved. It had been meant as a gift once, perhaps for Apollo or maybe for no one at all, born from a quiet moment of curiosity, when he had wondered how sound itself might be shaped like metal, how melody could emerge from fire and hammer. He drew it, down gently, blowing a fine layer of dust from the arching arms, running a cloth slowly along its curved body, reacquainting himself with its weight, its imperfections, its weighting. This was not an instrument for performance. It was too small, too humble, its resonance likely too soft for crowded courts or divine concerts. But that was never its purpose. It was a meditation in bronze, an attempt to give form to the kind of music that only solitude could hear. The music that lived in the pauses between thoughts, in the echoes of footsteps through stone chambers, in the flicker of firelight on cold metal. He heated a small length of wire and began to craft the tuning pins, shaping them one by one, not to precision but to balance, each fitting into its slot with a gentle twist. Then came the strings, not gut, like the mortal instruments, but a fine alloy of silver and gold, drawn so thin they shimmered like threads of light. Each one stretched with careful tension across the open frame. He tested each by plucking it with his thick, calloused fingers, and the notes that rang out were quiet and unsure at first, like voices just waking. But he nodded slowly as they settled, one after another, into a pattern that pleased him. Not a song not yet, but the beginning of one, something unfinished and eternal. He turned the lyre in his hands, holding it up to the low firelight, watching as the metal caught the glow and transformed it into soft color, copper deepening to red, silver blooming into pale yellow, gold catching in delicate flashes like embers that refused to die. There was something sacred about this object, not because it was divine, but because it was honest, because it was made not for power, not for purpose, but for beauty too quiet to be noticed by most. He set it upright on a wide block of pumice, surrounded it with fragments of volcanic glass and river stones he had gathered over the years, making a kind of altar not to a god, but to the act of listening. As he sat beside it, the lyre pulsed, gently in the warmth of the forge, the strings subtly vibrating with the heat, releasing faint tones like the murmurs of a breeze moving through tall grass. Hephaestus closed his eyes not to retreat from the world, but to feel it more deeply. The warmth against his skin, the music humming at the edge of silence, the memory of things he'd never seen but always known. He thought of a child, somewhere, in the mortal world, humming to themselves as they gathered firewood, or a fisherman tapping a rhythm on his boat's edge, or a widow whispering a lullaby to no one in particular. Music, like fire, belonged to everyone, and perhaps that was why he had been drawn to create this lyre, not to be heard but to remind himself that beauty was not always loud. He let the moment stretch, allowed the forge to remain quiet, the notes of the lyre drifting slowly into the space between the stones, between the breath of the mountain and the breath of the god who lived within it. This was not performance. It was presence. And as the warmth of the forge wrapped once again around him and the soft resonance of the metal strings faded into the silence of the deep earth, Hephaestus understood that even a god needed to remember what it was like to Simply sit and listen. The forge had grown hushed again, its fires now reduced to a low, steady pulse of heat barely visible beneath a layer of thick, slow-burning coals, their glow steady but unhurried, like the breath of something ancient resting after a long day's labor. Hephaestus sat beside the embers, not working, not thinking, just being, his body angled slightly toward the fire, his arms resting loosely on his knees, his eyes half-lidded but not closed. Around him the quiet had thickened, not in a way that stifled but in a way that comforted, wrapping around stone and metal and flesh like warm wool draped over old shoulders. This was the hour in which nothing needed doing, where tools could stay still and materials could rest untouched, where the act of not working became its own kind of sacred ritual. And yet, even here, creation lingered, not in movement, but in presence. The unfinished projects on the shelves did not call to him. They waited. The sculptures, the mechanical pieces, the gentle lantern, the breathing automaton, and the silent lyre all stood or lay in their places, not demanding attention, but offering it, quietly radiating the memory of the hands that made them. The warmth in the room was gentle now, not the fierce heat of shaping and melting, but a softer kind of warmth, the kind that lives in sun-warmed stones or old wood in the late afternoon. As Hephaestus leaned back against the curve of a broad column carved into the cavern's wall, he allowed his thoughts to drift freely with no expectation, no direction. He thought of the mountain that encased him, not as a prison but as a home, a vessel that held him and allowed him to be apart from the rest of Olympus with its tempests of vanity and voice. Here, there were no accusations, no eyes judging, the limp in his gait, no laughter behind hands, no need to prove divinity through spectacle. In this cavern, his value was in his stillness, his patience, his endless willingness to try again, and again, and again. That too was a kind of myth, one not told in songs but in the weight of tools, the rhythm of repetition, the quiet of the forge when nothing moves. Somewhere far above, storms may have rumbled, or feasts may have roared with praise and envy, but none of that pierced the thick stone that shielded this sanctuary. Hephaestus reached out to a small pile of river stones he had gathered in the past, perfectly smooth, round, flat, collected not for use but for their feel in the hand, for the soft click they made when knocked together. He chose one and turned it slowly in his palm, feeling its edges, letting its silence speak. It reminded him of the riverbeds mortals walked beside in spring, the coolness of water rushing over their feet, the way the world paused when they bent to pick up something they didn't need, but liked. The stone, like his work, like himself, had been shaped slowly, not by sudden force but by steady patience. And in this reflection, he felt no desire to rise, to forge, to craft, to plan. He simply allowed himself to exist, to be a god not of spectacle, but of stillness, of endurance, of the soft glowing heart of the earth that worked not through eruption, but through endless warmth. As the minutes or hours or centuries he could no longer tell stretched on, he leaned his head gently against the column, the stone cool but familiar. The automaton still breathed softly. The lyre hummed faintly in response to the air. The bird, the lantern, the spiral, and the box remained untouched. And in that quiet, in that long, sacred stillness, Hephaestus did nothing at all, and in doing so, fulfilled the deepest purpose of his forge, to be a place where the world's noise was silenced, and the soul of creation could simply rest. The gentle rhythm of the forge's quiet hours continued without interruption, as if the world had paused its turning, just enough to allow Hephaestus to remain untouched by time, enveloped entirely by the slow breathing of stone and flame. He stood now near the rear alcove of the forge, a shallow hollow carved deliberately into the cave wall centuries ago. Not for utility but for contemplation, a space where tools were never hung, where work never happened, where firelight flickered, more dimly, casting long dancing shadows across the walls like memories stretching outward. It was here that Hephaestus kept a single object not made by his own hands, a small wooden bowl, aged smooth with time, crafted long ago by a mortal whose name had long since been lost to history. He had found it abandoned near a mountainside village during one of his rare ventures to the surface, And though it bore no signature, no decoration, no hint of who had made it or for what purpose, it carried a shape so perfectly balanced, so humbly formed, that he had brought it back without hesitation. He did not polish it. He did not alter it. He let it remain as it had been, flawed, slightly warped from years of use, with a faint hairline crack near its base that had darkened with age. And yet, to Hephaestus, this simple bowl had become something sacred, not because of its craftsmanship, but because it reminded him that beauty could come from labor that no one praised, that meaning could exist in things left behind. Today, he picked it up again, turning it slowly in his hands, feeling the smoothness of the rim, the weight of it in his palm. He carried it to a flat slab of basalt beside the wall and set it gently down, watching as the low glow of the coals reflected, faintly off its rim. There was nothing in the bowl. It had never held wine or oil or offering since it came to the forge. Yet in its emptiness was a quiet fullness, a suggestion of use, of purpose once fulfilled and now quietly remembered. Hephaestus sat cross-legged. Beside it, his broad shoulders relaxed, his hands resting palms up on his knees, and for a long time he simply looked at it. There was no magic in this object. No divine energy hummed from its grain, but he knew, in the deepest part of his being, that this little bowl had held something once, perhaps fruit gathered by a child, or water carried from a stream, or bread offered at a family altar. Whatever its past life had been, it had lived, it fully. Hephaestus felt a kinship with it, this object of quiet service, this vessel of unnoticed contribution. The forge around him remained still. No hammer struck, no gears turned, yet something within this moment felt louder than any anvil's ring. It was as if the bowl was reminding him, gently, without insistence, that not all labor was seen, and not all creation needed memory to be worthwhile. The god who had made wonders beyond mortal comprehension, who had shaped weapons for Olympians and traps for Titans, now found the deepest peace in holding this anonymous, imperfect thing. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, and exhaled slowly, the breath curling into the warm air and disappearing. There was no need to do anything with the bowl. Its presence was enough. It belonged here now, a silent witness to the forge's slow rhythm, just as he did. Around them, the flames flickered on, casting soft light across the cavern floor, the bird sculpture barely visible in the distance, the automaton frozen in its eternal exhale, the lantern still pulsing softly on the shelf. Nothing moved, and yet everything was alive. The forge was a museum of patience, a temple to persistence, a monument to labor done without audience. And as Hephaestus closed his eyes for a moment, head bowed toward the simple wooden bowl, he felt not power or pride, but gratitude, pure and quiet, for the stillness that asked nothing of him and gave so much in return. The quiet continued, unbroken as the forge glowed with its usual warmth, subdued and steady, like an old friend content to sit in silence beside you, rather than fill the air with needless conversation. Hephaestus rose from where he had been seated beside the wooden bowl and moved slowly toward the wide stone basin near the forge's central pit, a large vessel filled not with fire or oil, but with cooled fragments of discarded metal. This was his scrap pile, though it did not resemble any pile of refuse in the mortal sense. The basin was carefully arranged, each piece laid down with a certain kind of reverence, not thrown or abandoned, but placed like a note in a musical score. Some pieces were leftovers from failed ideas, a hinge that had been too delicate for its purpose, a blade too warped to be corrected. Others were simply fragments trimmed from larger works, clippings from the creation of divine armor, curls of bronze left over from the shaping of crowns or chariots. But to Hephaestus, none of them were waste. Each fragment was a memory of motion, a shard of a once living idea. He knelt beside the basin and sifted through the pieces, letting them fall softly between his fingers with a soft clink and chime, like the distant echo of rain falling onto temple stones. He chose one, an oddly shaped twisted length of silver with a narrow loop at one end, and examined it not for its flaws but for its possibility. The way it curved reminded him of a stream winding through a valley, and the way the loop caught. The light made him think of how sunlight strikes dewdrops just before they fall. He placed it on a small anvil and began to shape it, not into a tool, not into a mechanism, but into something abstract, a flowing form, neither bird nor beast, neither ornament nor weapon, just the shape of a thought being remembered. It was rare that he made things like this, things with no use, no story, no function. But there were times, and this was one of them, when the act of shaping for no purpose was itself the purpose. Around him, the forge made its familiar sounds. The soft hiss of the remaining coals, the faint creak of old wooden beams adjusting in the shifting warmth, the distant, near imperceptible hum of the automaton's breath. These were the sounds of a place that had never asked for applause, that had never cared for recognition, only rhythm. As he shaped the silver into its new fluid form, Hephaestus thought of how often in Olympus things were made to impress, to dominate, to be admired. And yet here, in this hidden chamber beneath the mountain, things could simply be. He carved a small groove into the sculpture and set a single bead of glass within it, a green one, smooth and slightly misshapen, pulled from an old project that had never reached completion. Together, the metal and glass made something strange and calming, something like a river holding a raindrop in its palm. He turned it in his hands a few times, feeling its weight and balance, then placed it gently beside the bird and the box and the lyre, letting it join the quiet congregation of unspoken thoughts made solid. It belonged there, as all things did, when they were made with care. He stepped back once more, standing tall in the soft glow of the forge, the fire casting his silhouette long and deep across the stone floor. This was not a day for triumph. It was not a day for completion. It was a day for noticing the curve of metal, the warmth of stone, the way stillness fills the space between tasks like a breath held in peace. Hephaestus wiped his hands slowly, with a cloth, and returned to his bench, content not because of what he had made, but because of the way the forge continued to hold him, hour after hour, as constant as flame, as quiet as ash. The forge had entered another one of its deep silences, the kind that settled not just into the corners of the room, but into the folds of thought itself, blanketing everything in a hush that was not emptiness, but a kind of reverent pause. Hephaestus, sitting once again on his low stone bench, felt that silence wrap around him like the warm weight of a woolen cloak on a cold evening. His arms rested loosely across his lap, his feet planted firmly on the cool floor, and his gaze was turned inward, not toward the shelves or tools or glowing metal, but toward memory, the slow, strange paths of recollection that sometimes crept through the mind unbidden during hours of long solitude. He thought of the first time he had ever shaped molten ore with intention, when fire was not just fire but something alive, something to be spoken to, respected, partnered with. He remembered the awe of watching bronze pour into a carved mold, and realizing in that instant that he could give shape to things that had never existed before. Not just weapons or tools, but ideas, thoughts made tangible. And yet, in all those centuries since, it wasn't the grand works that stayed with him. It was the quieter ones, the hinges for a mortal's chest, the clasp on a goddess's necklace, the tiny set of tongs he'd made just for pulling reeds from a narrow vase. These memories passed through him like a stream passes through moss, gentle and constant, not needing words. As his thoughts drifted, he reached beside him for a small block of clay he had mixed days ago, now wrapped in damp linen to keep it soft. It was not the noble clay used by potters for amphorae or sculptures, but a rougher kind, gathered from a riverbed deeper in the mountain. He peeled back the linen, revealing the cool, pliable surface, and began to work it slowly between his hands, not to sculpt something finished, but to feel the shape emerge. He rolled it into a coil, then pressed it flat, folded it over itself, reshaped it, then pressed again. His fingers moved not with precision, but with curiosity, letting the material lead. What formed beneath his hands was a kind of crude tablet, no, larger than a loaf of bread, with uneven edges and a slightly bowed back. Into this, he began pressing small shapes using the ends of various tools. The flat head of a chisel, the rounded edge of a hinge, the tip of a gear. The result was not a readable script, but a language of pattern, symbols that meant nothing and everything at once. They were marks of presence, proof of a hand that had touched this thing, of time spent with no purpose beyond the act itself. He ran his fingers over the impressions, smoothing some, deepening others, letting the tablet speak to him not in words, but in the silence between them. When it was finished, or at least when it felt still, he laid it gently on a slab of stone to dry slowly, naturally, not in the fire but in the warmth of the room itself. It would harden unevenly, perhaps even crack. But that was all part of it. Some things were meant to age imperfectly, to carry the story of their making in every line and break. He looked around the forge, now dim and full of half-light, and saw not a workshop but a kind of living archive, one that held not the history of Olympus but the history of a single god's endurance. Nothing here was loud or urgent or gilded with divine glory, but everything here had been touched with care. He leaned back against the wall, clay still on his fingertips, and closed his eyes. The forge, always alive, always listening, held him as it always had, not as a god to be served, but as a soul to be heard. And in that long, steady quiet he needed nothing more. The hours slipped forward in the forge like molten metal running through narrow channels, slow and deliberate, shaping time as much as it shaped material. And Hephaestus, ever attuned to the rhythm of that slow current, rose again, without speaking or thinking, as if his limbs had quietly agreed upon their next task long before his conscious mind caught up. The forge was not just a space of fire and stone. It was a mind of its own, a vessel of stillness where choices often felt like echoes of something already known. He moved toward the old cabinet set deep into a crevice in the wall, where thin drawers were lined with materials collected over centuries: bone, ivory, obsidian, slivers of meteorite, rare crystals, and a few forgotten scraps of celestial bronze left over from the great wars of the gods. Each drawer had its own scent, its own weight, its own memory, and he opened them with the kind of gentleness one reserves for sacred things. From one narrow compartment, he withdrew a piece of carved horn, yellowed slightly with age, its surface, worn smooth along the curve where he had once run his thumb again and again, while considering a long-abandoned design. Today he felt drawn to it, not to finish the idea from before, but to let it become something else entirely. He laid the horn on his bench and began shaping a handle, not for a weapon or a tool, but for a small hand mirror. It was a delicate process, far more subtle than forging blades or armor, and one that demanded not just skill, but an attention to softness, how the curve should feel when held, how it should fit in the palm, not as a display of power, but as an object of quiet, reflection. The mirror itself would not be made of polished bronze as many were, but a thin disk of volcanic glass, so deeply black it held only vague reflections, more shadow than image. He affixed it gently to the handle using a fine silver clamp he had, once fashioned for another project, long forgotten, and etched along the edge a series of small, repeating lines. Not symbols, not decoration, just a pattern to suggest rhythm. When it was complete, he sat back and studied it, the way a mortal might study their own face in its uncertain surface. This mirror would never show clear truths, never reveal every detail. It would only hint, only offer shadows, only remind the viewer of their shape without giving them full command of it. And perhaps that was why he had chosen to make it. The gods, so used to seeing themselves through the eyes of others, rarely reflected inward, rarely paused to see not their glory, but their stillness. This mirror, if it was ever seen by another, would be a quiet challenge, to see without clarity, to observe without certainty. He placed it upright between two copper prongs on the shelf beside the lyre, and the sleeping bird and the breathing automaton, and it fit in perfectly with the others. Not loud, not dramatic, but complete. As he turned from the bench, he noticed how the light of the forge played across the glass surface, making it seem as if the mirror pulsed gently, like a memory just out of reach. The forge had accepted it, as it accepted all things made with care. He walked once more across the cavern floor, hands now free of tools, the echo of his sandals against the stone rhythmic and soft. Every item he passed seemed to glow faintly, in the low light, not with power but with presence, the way certain words linger long after being spoken. Hephaestus returned to the far wall and leaned his back against the warm stone, letting the weight of the day rest gently across his shoulders. Not heavy, not burdensome, but familiar. The forge was a sanctuary not just of making, but of remembering, and as he closed his eyes once more, the new mirror on the shelf captured a faint reflection of his form, blurred, flickering, incomplete, and that, he thought with calm satisfaction, was exactly as it should be. The forge was never truly dark, even when the flames were low and the embers slept beneath layers of ash. There was always a faint glow somewhere, be it from the pulsing lantern, the slow breath of the automaton, or the shimmer of volcanic glass, catching stray firelight. And in that soft illumination, Hephaestus once again moved, not with haste or urgency, but with the same patient deliberation that had defined his every step for centuries. Tonight, or what passed for night in this world without sky, his mind wandered toward the art of balance. Not the balance of weight or structure, which he mastered long ago, but the quiet balance between elements that did not naturally belong together: fire and water, metal and silence, permanence and imperfection. He approached the small pool at the far end of the forge, where a natural spring seeped through the rock, feeding a basin of gently rippling water as clear as polished obsidian. The pool had always been there, long before the forge had taken form around it, and though Hephaestus had shaped the space with stone and heat, he had never dared to redirect the spring. It was the forge's breath, its heart, cool, constant, and grounding. He knelt beside it now and watched the slow swirl of minerals drifting near the surface, tiny golden flecks and pale silver dust suspended in the water like stars in a hidden sky. Reaching down, he cupped the water in his palms, feeling its coolness seep into the scars along his fingers, its quiet resistance to his warmth reminding him that even in a space shaped by fire, some things would always move at their own rhythm. Inspired by that resistance, he stood again and moved to a nearby work table where several small flat stones lay waiting. Pieces of shale, each about the size of a hand, smooth from years of being handled, prepared, and then left untouched. He chose one with a faint greenish hue and began to carve a series of interlocking lines into its surface, shallow and precise, forming a pattern that had no beginning or end, a maze that was not meant to be solved, only followed. This was not a map. It was a meditation. With each stroke of the carving tool, he breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth, allowing the motion of the tool to set the rhythm for his body. The sound of metal on stone was soft, almost like writing. With a dull quill on thick parchment, the lines multiplied, weaving in and around each other, forming paths that doubled back, curled under themselves, and widened into open spaces with no purpose except to exist. When he finished, he carried the carved stone back to the spring and placed it gently in the shallow edge of the water, where it sank without fanfare, disappearing into the pool's surface like a thought dissolving into sleep. The maze would remain there, hidden and quiet, slowly absorbing the mineral-rich water, its edges softening over time until eventually it would fade back into smoothness, leaving only the memory of having once been touched. Hephaestus sat beside the pool and watched, his eyes following the play of light across the surface, the delicate shimmer of the stone just beneath, the way it blurred and shimmered under the water's gentle flow. It reminded him that not everything had to last. Not everything needed to endure to be meaningful. Some things could be created simply to vanish. In the forge, where so much of his work was built to withstand centuries and centuries, it brought him peace to shape something destined to disappear. The act itself, the carving, the placing, the stillness after, was the true creation. The rest was grace. As he sat there, the air around him thick with quiet, Hephaestus dipped, his fingers back into the spring and let them rest beneath the surface, feeling the soft pull of the current, the way the water tried, gently, to carry him. And for a while, he let it. The faint rhythmic ripple of the spring continued long after Hephaestus had stood and stepped away from its quiet pull, its surface once again calm, as if nothing had ever touched it. Yet, like all things in the forge, it held memory, not of noise or movement, but of presence, the soft imprint of a moment lived and then let go. Hephaestus walked slowly now through the length of the chamber, his sandals brushing against the stone floor with a sound that barely registered above the ambient breath of flame and stone. The air in the forge had thickened again, not with heat but with stillness, the kind that settles over old libraries or empty sanctuaries, where even silence seems to have texture. His path took him past shelves of abandoned prototypes, experiments, in function and form, some successful, some quietly forgotten, all treated with the same patient care. He paused before one such piece, an old folded mechanism of thin brass arms and leather straps, meant to simulate the movement of a bird's wing, not for flight, but for the illusion of breath, of subtle motion. It had never been finished. The wing didn't quite fold naturally, and the weight distribution had remained off despite weeks of minor adjustments. But today it called to him not as a project, but as a companion. He lifted it gently, the thin leather crackling slightly at the touch, the brass warm from the surrounding air. He carried it back to his main bench, not to fix it, but to watch it, to learn from it, to sit with the shape of something that had never quite become. He rested it on the table and turned it slowly in the light, watching how its joints caught and reflected the dim firelight in narrow golden flashes. The wing didn't move perfectly, it stuttered, hesitated, but even in that hesitation there was something sincere. Hephaestus reached for a soft cloth and began cleaning it slowly, not to restore it, but to acknowledge it. The way one might clean an heirloom, not for display, but for memory. Each motion was deliberate, each stroke a quiet exchange between maker and made. As he worked, he thought not of the gods or the mortals who had worn his armor or wielded his swords, but of this simple thing, a fragment of an idea, unfinished, uncelebrated, yet still here, still whole in its own quiet way. It had waited without complaint, and now, in this hour, it received attention not as failure but as witness. Beside the wing, he laid down a small strip of softened cloth and rolled it once into a spiral, placing it beneath the tip of the brass feathers to elevate them slightly, letting them rest as if supported by the air itself. It was a gesture of reverence, not repair. In this forge, the divine was not always in perfection but in patience, in time, in things left undone, but never unloved. Hephaestus leaned back and looked across the room, where the breathing automaton remained still. The bird sculpture rested in its quiet perch. The mirror reflected flickers of firelight without ever offering a clear face. All of it belonged. Finished, unfinished, purposeful, pointless, it made no difference. The forge held space for them all, just as it held space for the God who created them, not in a rush of glory, but in the deep, echoing stillness of repetition and care. As the fire behind him gave a soft pop and a single spark lifted into the air like a firefly breaking loose from its sleep, Hephaestus closed his eyes and let himself breathe with the forge, with the wing, with the silence that always remained when everything else had settled into its place. There was a particular depth to the forge's stillness now, a hush so complete it felt as though even the stone had chosen not to echo footsteps, as though the forge itself was pausing to listen, not for sound, but for thought. Hephaestus, moving gently through this quiet, returned to a narrow alcove carved deep into the left side of the cavern wall, a space few ever saw, even fewer understood. It was not a place of tools or fire, but of memory. Here, in small niches set into the stone like the tiny shrines in mortal homes, rested objects that held no function at all, personal relics of the god's own making, fragments from long ago, that he kept not for their beauty, nor for their use, but because they marked something invisible, a moment, a breath, a feeling. One shelf held a thin ring of iron, no jewel, no polish, warped from exposure to heat. Another held a tiny tile of fired clay with a single thumbprint pressed into the center, hardened forever in its place. And farther along, resting in a shallow dish of smooth black sand, lay a curved piece of glass, blue and green like shallow seawater, its edges dulled by time. None of these objects were labeled, none explained. They existed because they had once meant something to the one who shaped them, and that was enough. Today, Hephaestus brought with him something new to add. A small sculpture no larger than his palm, shaped from discarded brass shavings that he had fused together during the early morning hours. Not as a project, but as an idle meditation. It resembled no creature, no tool, no glyph. It was simply a curve that looped into itself, hollow at the center, smooth along the outer edge, as if meant to be held but not worn, admired but never fully understood. He placed it gently in one of the empty niches, nestling it into a bed of powdered stone dust that would keep it stable. Then he stepped back, hands at his sides, head slightly bowed, not out of reverence, but recognition. This too was part of his craft. Not just the forging, but the keeping. Not just the shaping, but the remembering. And in this alcove, amid the quietest echoes of a long, enduring life, Hephaestus felt a closeness to himself that he rarely allowed while working. These were not trophies. They were pieces of a quiet history. A god's memory made tangible in the form of things no one would ever ask for, or praise, or even notice. But here, in the warm glow of the ever-burning forge, they would remain, untouched and unjudged. He lingered a moment longer, letting the warmth of the nearby stone seep into his palms, letting the silence settle around him like ash on still coals. Then turning with the same slow grace that always marked his movements, he returned to the main chamber where the fire now burned a little brighter. The automaton exhaled gently, and the pulse of the lantern flickered in rhythm with his own steady breath. The forge did not celebrate or mourn, it simply continued as he did hour after hour. And as Hephaestus resumed his place at the bench, eyes lingering on the familiar array of tools and scraps and incomplete ideas, he felt no rush to begin again. Creation could wait. This too was part of the work. The forge was steeped in a gentle quiet that did not ask for movement, and yet, within its low golden light, the space remained alive. Not with noise or urgency, but with the deep, pulsing presence of things that had been made, that were being made, and that had not yet taken form. Hephaestus, sitting now at his central bench with a block of half-finished copper resting before him, felt the weight of that presence not as a burden, but as a calm expectation. The kind that comes not from obligation, but from familiarity, the way the sea calls to those who've lived beside it long enough to know its moods. He ran his fingers over the cool surface of the copper, tracing the faint hammer marks that remained from earlier work, not yet polished out, not yet refined. The copper still bore the raw signs of fire and pressure, and in that roughness he found something beautiful. There was honesty in the unfinished, in the surfaces not yet smoothed, in the lines not yet aligned. As he stared into the metals, soft reflection, catching distorted glimpses of his own face in the rippling patterns, he let his mind wander to the earliest stories of his own creation, the ones the mortals told. Some said he had been cast down from Olympus, thrown from the heavens by his mother Hera for being born imperfect. Others said he had been rescued, raised beneath the sea by nymphs, taught the patience of waves and the quiet endurance of coral. None of the versions agreed. None of them mattered. What remained true was the solitude, the long, undisturbed hours, the fire, the metal, the silence, and the work. Always the work. With a small chisel, he began to carve a simple line down the center of the copper, not deep, just enough to split the surface to create a sense of direction. Then gently, he widened that line into a channel, curving it slightly at both ends so it resembled the path of a river, bending, turning, not perfectly symmetrical but smooth, purposeful. Into this, he would later inlay a strip of pewter, something soft to contrast the copper's strength. a marriage of metals that had no reason to be joined except for the way they caught light together. It was a small act, unimportant to any god's legend, but it held meaning to him. A reminder that the strongest things could make room for softness, that what was forged in fire could still carry grace. The rest of the bench was quiet. No flurry of activity, no army of moving parts, only this one piece, this one thought unfolding in metal. Behind him, the shelf of earlier works remained still. The breathing automaton sat with its head tilted slightly toward the lantern. The bird lay, curled in its stone nest. The mirror offered its blurred reflection to the wall, and the maze stone continued to soak quietly in the spring's mineral waters. All of them, witnesses to the moment. Hephaestus paused for a moment, letting the chisel rest, listening, not to sound, but to feeling. The sense of being exactly where he needed to be, not above the world, not beneath it, but beside it. With his hand still, his mind drifted again to the mortals, those who never knew who shaped their shields or their locks or their hinges, those who lived and died never knowing their bread was sliced with a knife crafted in divine solitude. He thought of them with tenderness, not as worshippers or subjects, but as fellow makers, mothers weaving baskets, carpenters fitting beams, fishermen mending nets. They too labored in silence, shaping their worlds with tools and time. And in that way, they were kin. Hephaestus pressed the pewter into the groove and ran his thumb across the join, smoothing it without polish, leaving it matte and imperfect. Then he placed the piece beside the others, not in triumph, not for display, but because it now existed. That was enough. The forge exhaled softly, its warmth rising like breath from the earth, and he sat back, his shoulders relaxed, his tools resting quietly by his side. Another hour had passed, another act of creation complete, and the silence, faithful and endless, welcomed him back once more. The forge had settled into that quiet hum that arrived only after many hours of gentle work, when the fire no longer demanded to be fed and the air was thick with warmth but calm, without urgency. In that slow rhythm where every motion seemed to echo across centuries, Hephaestus rose from his bench and moved toward a side chamber, carved subtly into the rock, just beyond the main hearth. This part of the forge was narrower, quieter still, with walls stained by steam and age and shelves filled not with tools or supplies, but with pigments, ochres, grays, deep rusts, faint metallic greens, and crushed minerals stored in small, lidded clay bowls. This was the space where he worked with color, not in the way mortals painted myths upon amphorae, but in the more instinctive, intimate way of applying tone and texture to objects already made. Today he selected a small jar of iron oxide, a deep reddish brown that reminded him of clay fields after summer rain, and a slender wooden brush with bristles worn soft from use. Returning to the main chamber, he picked up a thin copper plate that he had beaten flat many weeks before and had left resting against a cool slab to wait for the right moment. Its surface was plain, no shape, no mark, simply the faint irregularity of handmade metal, the kind that catches light like fabric. Hephaestus began brushing the pigment across its face in long, slow strokes, not to decorate but to tint, to guide the eye into seeing warmth where there was only shine. The color settled gently into the microtextures of the plate, darkening some areas, leaving others brighter, creating a soft pattern that was not a picture, but a feeling. The act of brushing, of working with pigment rather than flame, slowed his movements even further, drawing out each motion until it felt like breathing. Steady, natural, grounding. As the color began to settle, he rinsed the brush in a basin of water warmed by the forge's constant breath, the reddish tint clouding the liquid like tea steeping in silence. He let it rest, then turned the plate in his hands, tilting it slightly, so the shifting pigment would catch the glow of the nearby fire. There was a beauty in it, simple, soft, earthy, not meant for display, not meant to be admired for its technique, but meant to sit quietly on a surface somewhere and age, to collect. Dust and scratches, to be touched and used and left out in the open. That, he thought, was the secret of good work. Not just what it was when first completed, but what it became after years of belonging to the world. He set the plate aside and wiped his hands on a length of old linen, then looked across the room, to the collection of completed works, the mirror, the spiral, the automaton, the sleeping bird, all waiting without expectation. Each had aged slightly since he made them, and that aging made them truer somehow, more alive. Nothing remained pristine in the forge, and nothing needed to. He moved slowly to the far edge of the cavern, where the walls grew darker and colder, and where he kept a small stone bench beneath a narrow vent that let in the faintest breath of outside air. It wasn't enough to see the sky or hear the wind, but it was enough to remind him that the world still turned, that time outside still moved, even if he did not follow it. He sat there for a while, his back against the cold stone, his eyes, watching the flicker of the forge's reflection across the curved ceiling. He thought not of Olympus or mortals or legacy, but of texture, of smoothness and grain, of the way pigment sat atop copper, of how ash settled into corners. These were the things that filled his mind, not because they were profound, but because they were true. Hephaestus did not need philosophy. He needed motion. He needed quiet. He needed the long, slow unfolding of a single day spent shaping the world one small, patient stroke at a time. And in that moment, as he rested with no fire roaring, no metal being shaped, no purpose but stillness itself, he understood that this too was work, not the kind that left marks on copper or bronze, but the kind that left marks on the soul. The hour had deepened into a softness that seemed to blur the edges of sound and space, and as Hephaestus sat in the stillness near the forge's breathing heart, the light dimmed into its most delicate form, a low amber that flickered like memory, more than flame. No new task called out to him now, no material demanded his attention, and the tools remained at rest on their shelves, aligned with the careful order only time and repetition could perfect. In this rare lull, when even his restless hands found no immediate project to shape, he turned to a quiet ritual he performed only now and then, one that had no product, no result, but served as a quiet reminder of his own enduring presence in the forge. From a drawer beneath his stone bench, Hephaestus withdrew a scroll of thin hammered lead, a soft metal often overlooked by the other gods, too malleable for armor, too heavy for ornament. Yet he treasured it not for its strength, but for its ability to hold memory. Its surface recorded every pressure, every mark, every movement without resistance. With a dull stylus carved from obsidian, he began to write. Not words, not language, but slow, curving lines that wound across the surface, in a pattern known only to him. They were impressions of thoughts, of moods, of feelings that had no translation, only texture. The stylus glided gently across the metal, etching shallow grooves that would catch the forge light like the paths of constellations sketched across the night. This act was neither art nor message. It was presence made visible. His breathing slowed with each line, syncing with the movement of his hand, and the forge around him seemed to quiet in response, the flame lowering itself in deference to the stillness of the moment. As he worked, the lead began to curl slightly at the edges from the warmth of his fingers, forming a loose scroll without being rolled. He paused now and then to study what he'd made, not with judgment, but with the calm recognition that even this, especially this, was part of the labor. Not everything had to be useful. Not everything had to endure. Some things could exist only as proof that he had been here, in this hour, shaping nothing more than a moment. When the sheet felt complete, he did not label it or date it or store it with care. Instead, he carried it to a high stone crevice above the main workbench, a narrow niche where dozens of such scrolls rested, layered upon one another like fallen leaves, each carrying the quiet fingerprint of a day passed in thought and solitude. He slid the newest one in without a sound, its edge catching slightly on an older piece before settling in. Then he stepped back, wiped the metal dust from his palms, and returned to the hearth. Around him, the forge glowed not brightly but with conviction, as if it understood the value of the act. In the distance, the automaton shifted slightly in its seat, reacting to a draft or perhaps to the subtle pressure of stillness itself. The shelves remained heavy with unspoken ideas. The carved bird, the spiraled rod, the memory stone from the spring, they all remained, unchanged, yet never truly inert. Hephaestus sat again, not to begin anew, but to rest in the truth that some days were made not for forging but for remembering. And in that breath between tasks, that hush between motions, he found something as precious as any flame-forged artifact. A moment that asked nothing, offered everything, and reminded him once more that even the god of fire needed to cool, to inscribe his silence, and to let it be enough. The air in the forge had taken on that particular stillness known only to places long undisturbed by chaos. A hush not of emptiness, but of settled things, of spaces content to hold breath without exhaling. Hephaestus moved with the weightless pace of someone who had forgotten the need to hurry, each step deliberate as though the very floor of the forge had grown used to his rhythm and guided his gait. He passed the familiar shadows, the breathing automaton with its quiet, steady rise and fall, the lantern with its faint pulse-like glow, the mirror that refused to give a clear answer, and approached a low, rounded stone table near the wall, where a collection of unfinished items had gathered like guests in a patient waiting room. These were not forgotten things, nor cast-offs. They were paused thoughts, each one bearing a fingerprint of intention that had never quite settled into completion. Completion. There was a slender strip of bronze twisted into a half-circle, once meant to become a bracelet for no one in particular. There was a sphere carved from basalt, smooth and dark, but hollow, its purpose undecided. And nestled between them was a block of pale wood stripped of bark, shaved smooth along one edge and left raw on the other, with a narrow crack running down its center like a quiet breath frozen in mid-inhale. Hephaestus sat beside these things and regarded them not with judgment, but with familiarity, as one might greet old acquaintances who had been away too long but were never far from the mind. He selected the wooden block, feeling the difference in texture between its surfaces, the sanded side and the side that still remembered the tree. With a fine-bladed carving knife, he began shaving into the raw half, not to shape an image or craft an object, but to follow the grain, to trace the lines the tree had already written in its rings. The blade whispered against the wood, removing only the thinnest curls which floated to the floor like whispers falling asleep. He was not trying to make something useful. He was only revealing what was already there. As the crack in the wood deepened slightly, he left it untouched, letting it remain, a quiet imperfection that gave the piece its voice. He did not fill it, did not correct it. He let it breathe. The fire behind him gave a gentle shift, not roaring, just adjusting its posture, and the forge seemed to lean in. With each stroke, Hephaestus felt the hum of the room respond, not with sound but with presence. It was in this hour, surrounded by half-formed things, that he was most fully himself. Not when the gods came calling for weapons or thrones or traps, not when his creation stirred awe or fear, but when he sat in silence, bringing something nearly invisible into being. When he finished carving, he set the block down beside the others, not transformed but touched, and looked at the growing gathering of unfinished, imperfect pieces. They were like verses with no ending, songs stopped mid-breath, the kind of art that was not bound by conclusion, and that perhaps was their beauty. Around him the forge pulsed gently, as if the walls themselves approved of the small, slow work done in the shadow of larger, louder myths. He sat back, wiping a curl of wood from his knee, and allowed himself to lean against the stone table, shoulder meeting cool rock. For a long while, he did nothing more. He simply sat with the quiet, with the wood, with the half-made, with the memory of what might one day be finished or might never be. And in that space, time softened. There were no hours, only patience, no projects, only presence, no need to begin again, no pressure to end. The forge had fallen into one of its gentlest moods, where light moved as slowly as thought, and even the air carried the weight of centuries in its warmth. In this soft lull, Hephaestus remained seated near the low stone table, his hands idle now, resting palms down on either side of the unfinished wooden block he had just carved. The scent of shaved wood still lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the constant undertone of heated metal and ancient stone. Nothing called him to stand, and so he didn't. Instead, his eyes wandered upward, toward the ceiling of the cavernous forge, where the surface, though high and uneven, bore subtle marks, Indentations, soot stains, long streaks of dark where smoke had climbed and curled over the years. It was not beautiful in the way Olympus expected beauty. It was the kind of ceiling that only patience could admire. A history of fire etched into stone. A gallery of time left untouched by polish or praise. And it reminded Hephaestus of something few of the gods ever stopped to consider. That the most enduring creations were often those never meant to be noticed. He stood slowly, bones moving with the calm ache of age not as weakness, but as memory made physical, and walked toward a tall shelf near the back of the forge, a shelf where things too odd or too uncertain had been stored over the years. He scanned its contents with the practiced ease of someone who remembered each piece by its shape and the story it didn't tell. He chose a narrow rod of lead, cool and slightly bent, and beside it, a ring of stone with a hole through its center. Once, part of an attempt at a wind chime for a temple garden that had never been completed. He brought them both to the table, and without a specific intention, began to bind them together, using a fine strip of bronze wire, twisting slowly, methodically, with no clear goal in mind other than the pleasure of joining things. The rod passed through the stone's center like an axis, and when balanced carefully across two support pegs, the entire shape gently tilted forward, then settled still. It rocked like a pendulum that had chosen to stop, and Hephaestus smiled, softly, not at the cleverness of the form, but at the stillness it evoked, a physical echo of the moment itself. He left it there on the table, slightly off-center, imperfect in proportion, yet utterly complete in spirit. Sometimes, he thought, making was not about solving or finishing, but about marking presence. The wire held the pieces loosely on purpose so they could shift over time, as metal does when it remembers heat and gravity. Behind him the flame gave a soft exhale, and the lantern flickered faintly in agreement. He walked once again across, the stone floor, slower now, not from fatigue but from respect for the quiet. At the far wall stood a narrow alcove where a bowl of black glass had been left to collect fragments, shards of past works, slivers of broken tools, offcuts from divine commissions. He picked up a small triangular chip of gold, no larger than a thumbnail, and rolled it between his fingers before dropping it into the bowl, listening to the soft clink as it landed among the others. Each sound was different. Each sound was enough. These were not leftovers. These were echoes, reminders that even what didn't remain whole had once been part of creation. He remained there a while longer, his hand resting on the edge of the bowl, his eyes lowered. Then, with no ceremony, he turned and returned to the central chamber. He did not pick up his tools, he did not begin a new piece. He simply walked past his creations, the mirror, the bird, the box, the automaton, and touched each one lightly with his fingertips, not as a check, not as a test, but as a greeting, as if to remind them, and perhaps himself, that they were not forgotten, that they had been made with time and were held by it still. And in that quiet gesture the forge seemed to inhale and exhale with him, as if the space itself had paused to recognize that every act of care, no matter how small, no matter how slow, was also an act of memory. As the forge deepened into the quiet middle stretch of its eternal day, a time without clocks, without bells, without sunrises or sunsets to declare progress, Hephaestus found himself once more drawn to the long, curved bench that ran along the inner wall of the chamber, where the stone dipped just slightly inward as though the mountain itself had once leaned in to listen. It was a space he often returned to not to create, but to observe, to sit and let the slow tide of fire and breath move around him without demanding anything in return. On the bench lay a flat piece of slate, dark and smooth and cool to the touch, a surface he used sometimes not for carving or measuring, but simply to sketch thoughts in ash and dust with his fingertips. Today he brushed a light layer of coal powder across the surface using a strip of worn linen, then pressed the pads of his fingers into the dust, drawing without design, letting instinct guide the motion. The result was a series of circles, overlapping, incomplete, uneven, like ripples from invisible drops of water falling into an invisible pool. He did not pause to correct them. Each one felt like a breath, a pulse, a record of quiet rhythm. He stared at the forms for a long time, letting his mind drift not forward into future works but backward into memories that had no sharp edge. Only the soft echo of tools, long since cooled, of laughter heard once and then never again, of hands held in silence before parting without anger. The forge held those memories too, not as images but as air, as warmth, as the worn smoothness of surfaces touched 1,000 times without thinking. Beside the slate he found an old wire figure he had bent into shape centuries ago. No limbs, no face, just a looped frame that could have been a person or a symbol depending on how it was held in the light. He placed it at the center of the drawn circles and watched how it cast a thin shadow across the dust. For a moment, that was enough. A figure surrounded by motion, by presence, by unspoken meaning. He wiped the slate clean with one pass of his palm, the dust rising briefly, then settling into the folds of his linen robe. There was a certain comfort in erasure, in the knowledge that something had been there and now was not. The memory of the act was stronger than the image itself. Standing slowly, Hephaestus turned back toward the shelves that lined the deeper part of the forge, and his eyes landed on a small box of brass hinges, unfinished, unpolished, resting where they had waited patiently for decades. He picked up one and turned it over in his hand, feeling the tension in its joint, the resistance in the pin that had yet to be oiled. This hinge had no door. It had never been attached to anything, and perhaps it never would be. But even so, he admired its quiet potential, its readiness to serve, to connect, to bear weight without question. That, too, was a kind of beauty. He set it gently on the workbench, not as a beginning but as a presence. Nearby, a shallow dish of olive oil reflected the forge light like molten gold. He dipped his fingers into it, warmed slightly from the air, and used it to lubricate the hinge, working the motion back and forth until it gave just a little more easily. Then he wiped the excess oil onto a scrap of cloth, placed the cloth under the hinge, and stepped away. It needed nothing more. It was whole in its waiting. The forge exhaled again, the faint crackle of coals whispering through the chamber, and Hephaestus closed his eyes. Around him were thousands of pieces, some completed, some begun, many neither, and each one told a part of the same quiet story. That the act of making, of touching, of choosing to continue hour after hour was its own kind of myth. One that required no thunder, no battle, no chorus, just time and fire and stillness. The forge, as always, remained a world unto itself, untouched by the constellations shifting in the sky above, by the passing of mortal seasons, or the politics of Olympus that moved like windstorms through the realm of gods. Inside this deep breathing sanctuary of warmth and patience, Hephaestus moved with a deliberate quiet, as though speaking too loudly or stepping too fast might disturb the balance of the chamber. His latest task was neither grand nor planned, but it had begun in the soft corners of his mind hours earlier, when he noticed the way a small crack had formed along one of the oldest walls of the forge. It wasn't dangerous, not structural, but it had a shape he found oddly beautiful, like a lightning bolt captured mid-motion, frozen in time against the stone. He knelt beside it now, running his fingers along the jagged path, not with worry, but with the same gentle attention he gave to a fine seam in a golden chain. He didn't wish to repair it. Instead, he intended to honor it. Reaching for a thin rod of gold from his nearby supply cart, one of many he kept for detailing divine commissions, he began to melt the end using a focused flame, coaxing it slowly into a delicate stream of metal. With the point of a slender stylus, he carefully traced the molten gold along the edge of the crack, not filling it in, but bordering it, emphasizing its lines the way a sculptor enhances shadows with polish and stone. The gold cooled quickly, solidifying in a matter of breaths, leaving behind a glowing thread that now ran the length of the fracture like a vein of light through dark mountain skin. It was imperfect work, intentionally so. The purpose was not to conceal the crack or erase it, but to frame it as part of the room's memory, as something the forge itself had earned through years of heat and breath and waiting. He stepped back to admire the result. A silent mark, of age now traced in brilliance, the kind of beauty that only appears when time is allowed to leave its mark, and when the maker chooses to highlight instead of hide. It reminded him of a practice he'd once seen in a faraway mortal land, where broken pottery was repaired with veins of precious metal, the fracture made holy rather than hidden. That philosophy, though mortal in origin, had always struck him as more divine than many of the grander displays of power he had been asked to forge. Once satisfied, he blew gently across the line of gold, clearing away a bit of dust, then reached for a cloth to press the softened edges into the stone, ensuring it would not catch or splinter. Around him, the forge glowed approvingly, the warmth of the fire rising just a touch as if nodding in silent agreement. He turned toward the bench where a bowl of obsidian marbles sat, each one unique, each one made in moments of quiet experimentation. He selected one, its surface smooth, its shape imperfect, and placed it gently into a hollow just above the crack he'd adorned, a finishing gesture. It sat there like a watchful eye, like punctuation at the end of a quiet poem. Hephaestus returned to his bench, but didn't reach for a tool. He sat and let his gaze wander over the golden fracture, the soft shadows dancing along the edge of the room, the objects scattered like memories across the shelves. He didn't need to move. The act of having moved was enough. The forge, alive, in the way old places sometimes are, seemed to breathe in concert with him. And together they rested, not in silence, but in understanding. This was how the god of fire endured, not with thunder but with threads of gold drawn across broken stone, with patient gestures that meant everything to no one but himself, and with the knowledge that every imperfection, if treated with care, could become a story worth preserving. The hours inside the forge had lengthened into something dreamlike, no longer measured by fire's intensity or the number of completed tasks, but by the subtle changes in air and atmosphere, the way shadows moved slowly across the walls and how silence deepened with each passing moment. Hephaestus now sat at his secondary bench, a narrower slab tucked into a recessed curve of the forge, where smaller, more intricate work took place. Here, the tools were finer, thinner, many no larger than the tip of a finger, kept in rows of shallow grooves carved into the stone surface. Before him lay a small disk of polished tin, no larger than a mortal's open palm, its surface gleaming faintly in the amber glow of the forge's ever-patient fire. He had picked it from a box of leftover pieces not because it called to him, but because it didn't, because it had remained silent, neutral, unchosen for so long that it had begun to feel like stillness made solid. Today he wanted to offer it a voice, not in the way a divine artifact might roar with power, but in the way a whisper lingers after the room has emptied. Taking the thinnest of etching tools, Hephaestus began to scratch gentle lines across the surface, nothing complex, nothing ornate, just small arcs, soft curves, almost like waves or breath marks. The metal gave way with little resistance, as though it had been waiting all along to be touched, to be given form. He worked slowly, pausing often, not out of uncertainty, but to listen, to feel the quiet shape of what wanted to emerge. It was not a sigil. It was not a crest. It was not something to be interpreted. It was simply a pattern of presence, of movement across stillness. When the lines were complete, he ran a cloth lightly across the disk to remove the dust, then held it up to the fire. The etchings caught the light like the surface of wind-ruffled water, shimmering in motion though the metal itself did not move. Pleased, he set the disk upon a small clay stand and left it there, facing no one, waiting for nothing. That was enough. He turned back to the box of leftover metals and pulled out a slender sliver of iron, slightly bent, almost sharp at one end. It had the look of something that had once been part of a hinge or a clasp, but now stood alone, undefined. He took it and gently bent it further into a loose spiral, then used a file to smooth the point into a rounded edge, softening the danger, inviting the possibility of touch. There was something deeply soothing about reshaping forgotten things, about showing them they still had form, still had meaning even without purpose. The forge around him agreed, humming with the steady breath of old fire and worn stone. its walls carrying the golden warmth like a blanket tucked gently around everything that lived within. He stood briefly and stretched, his muscles heavy but not sore, the kind of heaviness that came from contentment rather than fatigue. He walked once around the chamber, fingers grazing the walls as he passed, like a blind man tracing memory through the architecture of a place that had become more than home. It had become a reflection of his own soul. Every crevice, every crack, every tool and scrap held some memory of touch, some echo of thought. Hephaestus paused near the stone window slit where a thin line of air sometimes drifted in from far above, and though he could see no sky, he imagined it, blue and wide and
indifferent.
He did not miss it. The forge was not confinement, it was sanctuary, a place where nothing demanded greatness, only presence, where even the smallest gesture, an etched curve, a softened edge, a spiral formed from leftover iron, could carry the same weight as a myth if done with care. Returning to his bench, he placed the new spiral beside the disc and let his hands fall still. Around him the silence returned, not empty, but full of things unspoken. The god of fire, of making, of endurance, allowed himself to sit without task, without thought, and in that pause he was most truly himself. Not a craftsman for gods, not a builder of traps or thrones, but a keeper of quiet, a steward of stillness, a witness to the sacred rhythm of things coming slowly into being. There was a rare clarity to the forge now, not in brightness or sound, but in the way everything within it had settled into place, as if the room itself had exhaled and chosen stillness over activity, presence over production. Hephaestus stood in the far corner where the light didn't quite reach, where the floor dipped into a shallow recess lined with smooth, dark stones warmed by the gentle breath of the earth itself. This corner was not for work, nor display, nor storage. It was a quiet threshold, a space untouched by flame or tool, where nothing was ever built and yet where every thought began. He came here sometimes to stand, not to plan, not even to rest, but to let the weight of the forge lift slightly from his shoulders. The warmth here was softer, less direct, a subterranean heat that rose in waves and seemed to carry memory with it the way incense carries the last syllable of a whispered prayer. As he stood in the gentle heat, his hands relaxed, and with them, his breath slowed into a rhythm that echoed in the center of his chest like a low drum beat. Before him, in a small indentation in the wall, rested a shallow dish of pumice stone filled with smooth black pebbles, each one gathered over time from the farthest edges of the forge. Corners where projects had failed or where pieces had fallen and been forgotten, corners where silence had grown thicker than fire. He reached down and let his fingers trail. Through the stones, the sensation grounding him more than any tool ever could. Then, without choosing, he picked one and held it in his palm. It was small, cool, and perfectly ordinary, oval-shaped, without shine or flaw, a stone like any other. Yet in this space, in this moment, it was enough. He turned it slowly in his hand and walked toward the wall opposite the recess, where dozens of such stones had been placed on narrow ledges carved into the stone. No arrangement, no symmetry, just the quiet accumulation of moments remembered. He placed the new stone among them and stepped back. It did not matter where it sat. Its presence was what mattered. These stones were not records of achievement. They were reminders of time past, of things endured, of gestures that left no mark except the mark of having been. As the fire behind him murmured softly, and the forge's breath circled the room in a lazy, familiar draft, Hephaestus let his shoulders drop, the tension sliding down and out like iron cooling in water. There were no visitors today, no divine requests, no urgent commissions to complete. Just the slow, unfolding stillness of a place where making and being had become the same. He sat on the edge of the recess, feet planted firmly against the warm stone, and gazed across the forge. Every item told its story, not loudly, not in language, but in form and presence. The breathing automaton, the sleeping bird, the box with the brass hinges, the lyre with silver strings that hummed faintly in shifting air, each one a quiet hymn to endurance, each one part of a chorus, sung without sound. He reached to the side and picked up a small length of twine left behind on the bench beside him. It frayed at one end, soft and useless by most standards, but in his hands, it became something more. He began to knot it slowly, not into a design, but into a sequence, a rhythm of fingers moving, releasing, pulling tight again. With each knot he thought of nothing, and yet everything passed through him. Memories of fire, metal, solitude, laughter, silence, exile, return. He tied 12 knots, one after the other, until the twine grew short. Then he looped it once, and laid it on the floor beside the stones. He didn't need to keep it. It didn't need to last. It only needed to have happened. And that was enough. He leaned back, propped one elbow on the stone, and watched as the forge returned to its quiet pulse, not asleep, not awake, just waiting, always waiting like him. And in that rhythm where time no longer pressed forward and the world outside felt very far away, Hephaestus smiled. Not for joy, not for pride, but for the quiet comfort of knowing he had shaped yet another hour, not with flame but with stillness. The forge, ever aglow with its restrained and thoughtful light, had now entered one of its most subdued moods, a quiet that was not the absence of activity, but the full presence of calm, of work completed without fanfare, of motionless meaning. Hephaestus stood once again at the central workbench, not to build or etch or shape, but to rearrange. Before him was a small collection of items he had made over the last few days: the spiral of softened iron, the pewter-inlaid copper plate, the wire-bent figure, the tin disc with its curved etchings. None of them were large. None of them carried function. But each held something quieter, evidence of his hours, of his breath, of his choices. He did not intend to organize them according to size or material or theme. Instead, he placed them in a slow arc across the bench, allowing each one space enough to rest without touching the others, like stars loosely scattered across an open night. The arrangement was temporary. He knew that. But it felt important to acknowledge these pieces not just as objects, but as pauses made visible, as the physical residue of thought and feeling shaped by fire and hand. Once he finished arranging them, he circled the bench slowly, observing them from different angles, noting how the light shifted across each surface, how the glow from the forge softened one curve and deepened another. It was like watching a silent conversation unfold, between things that did not speak, a quiet community of intention. He pulled a chair closer, not the stone bench he typically used, but a small stool he had carved from a block of cedar long ago, smoothed and hollowed over time by his weight, and sat with his forearms resting on his knees. His fingers, still, smudged with a fine trace of metallic dust, curled gently inward, not from tension but from familiarity. He stared at the objects, letting his mind drift not into their purpose, but into their presence. Each piece reminded him of a moment, one made when the forge was loud, one shaped in near darkness, another conceived just after a dream he could no longer remember. They were not masterpieces, and that was precisely why he valued them. They were honest. They were true, and they had no audience but him. A soft breeze stirred through the narrow vent high in the cavern, bringing with it a trace of mineral earth and distant dampness, perhaps a mountain stream or morning dew seeping down through stone. The draft curled lazily through the room and flickered the flame, sending shifting light across the arc of objects like a passing thought. One of the pieces, the wire figure, swayed gently in response, not from imbalance, but from invitation. Hephaestus smiled faintly and let the moment pass without interfering. Then after a while he reached forward and picked up the tin disc, turning it slowly in his hands. It felt cool at first, then warmer as it absorbed the heat of his palm. He studied the etched lines, not as an artist studies a finished work, but as a friend examines the face of someone they've known a long time. He turned it over, ran a thumb along the edge, and then, without ceremony, placed it back down, not in its original position, but slightly to the left. The arc shifted, the balance changed, and something about the space felt even more at peace. He let out a slow breath and leaned back. The forge was quiet again, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that needed to had already been said, in brass and tin, in wire and wood, in stillness and the spaces between. Hephaestus sat like that for some time, the god of the forge, surrounded not by fire and thunder, but by the gentle orbit of the things he had chosen to shape, not for power, not for legend, but for the simple act of remembering what it feels like to care. Time had stretched so thin within the forge that it no longer felt like something to be measured, but something to be breathed. A slow, quiet rhythm that moved not in minutes or hours, but in the shifts of warmth across the floor, the gentle settling of dust on unmoving tools, the faint expansion and contraction of stone that had grown used to holding heat. Hephaestus remained seated at the low cedar stool, still as one of his own sculptures, watching the arc of objects on his workbench with the kind of attention that asked nothing in return. The forge, always alive in its own way, did not push him forward nor hold him back. It simply allowed. And in that allowing, the god of fire found his most honest form. Rising slowly, Hephaestus walked to the old chest built into the back wall, its iron hinges rusted slightly from age, the wood worn smooth by centuries of touch. Inside were not treasures or tools, but cloth, scraps of woven linen, wool, and softened leather, many stained with soot, oil, and metal dust. These were the rags of his labor, and he cherished them more than any golden ornament forged for Olympus. He selected a length of dark brown wool, frayed at the edges but whole, and carried it back to the bench. One by one he began wrapping each object in the arc with the cloth, not to hide them but to give them rest. The spiral, the figure, the disc, the plate. They each received the same slow, careful gesture, folded and tucked as if being put to bed. When he finished, the arc was gone, replaced by a gentle mound of covered forms, each one cradled in fabric that had once wiped heat from metal, caught sparks, and protected his hands. He placed the bundle into a shallow wooden tray and slid it into a recess beneath the bench, where other similar trays lay, stacked but not catalogued. Hephaestus did not archive his work. He remembered it with his hands, with his breath, with the way his body felt after the shaping was done. Afterward, he remained standing for a while, the fire behind him throwing his shadow long across the floor, past the breathing automaton and the bird-shaped sculpture, beyond the box and the mirror and the maze soaking in the spring. The forge was filled with his echoes, not loud, but steady, like ripples in deep water after a single stone has fallen. He walked now to the water basin near the spring, dipped his hands into the cool surface, and let the temperature draw the warmth from his skin. The shock was subtle but awakening, a reminder that he was not made only of fire, that even the god of flame needed to feel the quiet insistence of water from time to time. He scooped a handful to his face, letting the drops roll down his beard, dripping back into the pool without ceremony. Then, from a shallow dish nearby, he pulled a smooth stone that had rested there for years, a gift from a riverbed long forgotten. He turned it once in his hand and placed it atop the stack of wrapped objects as a kind of seal, not to protect them, but to mark the moment they were finished. It was not a ritual born of Olympus, but one born of rhythm, of knowing when something had reached stillness. Returning to his stool, he sat again and looked out over the forge, now dimmed in tone but not in warmth. Everything had slowed. Everything had found its place. He picked up a piece of charcoal from a bowl on the bench and began drawing on the stone beside him. Not a figure, not a symbol, just lines, like the ones he had etched into the tin. Spirals, arcs, circles overlapping, not for meaning, but for motion. When he stopped, he did not look back at the drawing. He left it there, raw and incomplete, knowing that tomorrow or next century he might add more or rub it away entirely. That was the nature of the forge, to hold what was made and what was let go with equal reverence. And so, with his back straight, his hands stained, his eyes half-lidded in the firelight's rhythm, Hephaestus rested once again. Not because the work was done, but because the work, as always, could wait. A subtle shift in the warmth of the forge signaled nothing to the outside world. There were no clocks here, no bells, no celestial bodies to cast light through windows. But Hephaestus knew the moment for what it was. It was a hinge between stillness and movement, a gentle turning of the forge's breath from one phase of quiet into another. He rose from the cedar stool, his joints uncomplaining but steady, like well-used iron hinges that had never rusted, and walked toward a stone alcove where the least visited items of the forge resided. This niche held no objects of use, no tools of divine purpose, but instead a series of tall, narrow glass vessels, each filled halfway with fine dust collected from different parts of the forge over the centuries. Some held bronze shavings, others traces of cooled slag or powdered stone from collapsed chisels. They were not labeled, nor organized by date or project. They were simply collections of what had once been motion, now settled into stillness. He selected one filled with a fine silver-gray dust from a forgotten batch of tempered steel, an especially soft, silky powder that clung to the glass as if reluctant to leave. Carrying it back to the workbench, he laid a shallow ceramic bowl beside it and gently poured the dust until it formed a soft hill, letting it spread naturally without shaping or smoothing. He reached for a single flat brass blade, dull and wide like a painter's spatula, and with feather-light motions began drawing lines through the dust. Not deep, not symmetrical, just soft channels that wandered from one edge to another, spiraling at times, colliding, curving back on themselves without reason. It was perhaps a form of drawing, though there was no image to be made. It was more like walking barefoot through sand, marking presence through passing. The dust responded like memory, falling gently back into itself when displaced, yet never quite erasing the paths his hand had made. With every slow stroke, Hephaestus thought, not of outcome but of the movement itself. This too was work, though no one but the forge would witness it. The lines formed a map of nowhere, a record of time without event, and when it felt complete, not finished but settled, he set down the blade and cupped his hands around the bowl, not to move it, but simply to feel the warmth rising from the dust, subtle as breath against skin. Around him the forge had dimmed to its lowest light. Not dark, but dusk-like, with every object seeming to fold slightly inward, as though exhaling after long attention. He stood and walked to the low shelf that ran beneath the breathing automaton. The figure sat in its eternal posture of restful alertness, shoulders gently rising and falling, head tilted to listen to a sound no longer spoken. He pulled a small linen cover from a nearby peg and draped it lightly over the automaton's back, not to conceal it, but to acknowledge the day's end. Not by sun or moon, but by the feeling that enough had happened. Enough had been shaped. Enough had been remembered. He returned to the ceramic bowl, now resting quietly with its soft spiral of dust undisturbed, and placed a small hand-carved lid over it. It did not seal the bowl. It only shaded it, preserving the presence of the marks without capturing them, completely. The forge responded with a low creak from its wooden beam, a sound like an old breath drawn in slowly, a sign that the space approved. Hephaestus smiled faintly, the kind of smile that does not reach the face but remains behind the eyes, and sat once more. Nothing was left to do. And yet, everything felt full. His gaze drifted toward the far wall where fragments and relics of forgotten tools were stored, not for their usefulness but for their truth. And in the comfort of that gaze, surrounded by quiet metal, soft dust, and the warm hum of silence, the god of fire rested, his hands folded, his tools at peace, his forge as steady as the beat of an old, eternal heart. The forge breathed softly, in the stillness no longer glowing with the eager brightness of a fresh flame, but smoldering with the low, even warmth of something ancient and eternal, a heat that asked nothing, offered everything, and demanded only patience. Hephaestus stood near the spring-fed basin again, watching the mineral-rich water ripple in slow circles across the smooth stone surface, disturbed only by the occasional drop that fell from a hidden vein in the rock above. He did not reach into the water this time. He simply observed. The reflection it offered was soft and fractured, not from clarity or depth, but from the subtle movement within, a gentle resistance to stillness that made it feel more alive. The god of the forge, whose hands had shaped divine weapons and mortal wonders alike, now found himself more interested in the reflection of light and water than in any material waiting on his bench. It was not distraction. It was attention, refined and deliberate, tuned to the quietest parts of his world. After several moments, he turned and made his way to a narrow wall alcove tucked behind one of the great support columns of the chamber, a place few would notice even if they stood before it. For within it was a simple shelf where Hephaestus kept a small wooden box, its lid slightly bowed from age, its surface scarred by heat and the faint trace of soot. This box held no precious gems, no scrolls, no secret designs. It held only fragments, bits of twine, slivers of broken gears, snapped-off ends of rivets, and tiny coils of wire too short to be reused. Useless pieces by most standards, but not to him. Each fragment had once been part of a motion, part of a moment where care had been given, where something had been attempted. He removed the lid slowly, as one might uncover a fragile memory, and looked inside with a quiet familiarity. After a pause, he reached in and selected a broken pin, its surface warped from a failed casting years ago. He carried it back to his bench and placed it beside an unfinished slate tile, blank but smoothed, prepared for etching. He pressed the pin into the slate, not to carve it, but to leave a faint indent, a soft circular mark. Then he moved the pin and did it again, closer this time, creating a second mark, then a third, and so on, until the tile bore a loose constellation of tiny impressions. It was not a pattern. It was not art. It was a record of a broken object continuing to shape the world in small ways. He looked at the pin once more, then tucked it gently into a groove in the stone at the edge of the bench, letting it rest like a needle that had sewn its final thread. The forge was utterly quiet now, the kind of stillness that only came after long hours of uninterrupted thought, when the space itself had grown tired of waiting for more and simply agreed to rest. Hephaestus remained still, surrounded by pieces, not finished but not abandoned, pieces that, like him, had settled into the dignity of endurance. He walked past the automaton, past the stone bowl filled with dust, past the mirror that never reflected clearly, and touched the wooden box that held the bird sculpture once more, just briefly, his fingers brushing over the grain as though confirming its continued presence. Then, rather than returning to his bench or his stool, he sat on the ground itself, back against the base of one of the wide columns that held the roof aloft. The stone was warm where the forge's heat had reached, and cool where the air from the vent stirred faintly through. Here, half in warmth, half in shadow, he let his body rest, his mind drift. He looked at nothing, thought of nothing, but felt everything. The presence of the fire, the weight of the earth above, the history, in every mark on the wall, the purpose in every pause. And as the forge wrapped itself around him like it always had, not as a place of labor but as a companion in solitude, Hephaestus let himself sink into that deep, sacred quiet, where even gods become still. Time, if it still existed within the forge, had grown so soft and slow that it no longer felt like something passing, but something present, woven into the warmth of the stone, into the quiet pulse of the ember bed, into the steady breath of the one god who had learned not to rush. Hephaestus stirred gently from where he sat against the column, his body rising not out of need or discomfort, but simply because the moment to sit had ended, and the moment to move had begun. With his bare feet pressing against the smoothed stone floor, he stood and walked toward a recessed shelf set low into the forge wall, a space nearly invisible from the central chamber unless one knew to look for the faint curve of shadow that framed it. It was here that Hephaestus kept what he called his quiet metals, small ingots of alloys that had never been named, made in moments of intuition rather than instruction, melted from mixtures too subtle or accidental to repeat. Some had been created when water from the spring had splashed unexpectedly into molten copper. Others were formed from filings swept from different tables, fused into lumps that shimmered faintly with no consistent hue. These were not used for divine armor or enchanted chains. They were used for touch, for objects he would shape only when he needed to listen, to himself, to the forge, to the silence. Today he selected an ingot the color of tarnished silver with a hint of green in its depth, and placed it into a small crucible over a low flame. He did not fan the fire or stoke it. He simply let the warmth rise slowly, gradually coaxing the metal into softening without force. While it warmed, he prepared a simple mold, a circular depression carved into a thick block of pumice stone, not deep, just wide enough to hold a shallow disc. He dusted it with fine ash, then smoothed it with the flat of his palm. When the metal had turned thick and liquid, more like honey than water, he poured it carefully into the mold. No hiss, no flare. Only the gentle sound of hot metal touching prepared stone. He sat beside it, letting it cool naturally, refusing to rush what time itself was willing to do. As the minutes passed, he watched the surface dull, shifting from mirror bright to soft matte, then to the faintest shimmer of crystallized grain. When it had hardened just enough, he lifted it from the mold and placed it on a slab of cooled marble to finish settling. It was nothing more than a disc, plain, weighty, undefined, but in it lived a moment of pure listening, a record of patience rendered into form. He reached for a stylus and etched a single curved line across the surface, not centered, not measured, just a breath made visible. Then he stood, held it at arm's length, and nodded. He would not polish it. He would not mount it. He would not name it. He simply placed it on a shelf among similar pieces, each one unique, each one a relic of silence and stillness. As he turned away, he passed the familiar objects once more, each still where he had left them, each unchanged, each part of a language that did not require speech. The automaton still breathed. The lantern still pulsed. The spiral still rested in its tray. And beyond them, near the spring, the soft maize stone continued to soak, its edges slowly blurring like memory softening at the edges. Hephaestus sat again, not on the bench, not at the stool, but cross-legged on the floor, directly before the forge, close enough to feel the heat on his face, but far enough to remain still. His hands rested on his knees, his eyes half lowered. He did not plan his next work. He did not remember the last. He only listened, to the fire, to the air, to the shape of the room as it echoed back everything it had ever held. And in that moment, he was not forging. He was not waiting. He was simply there, as he had always been, as he would always be, shaping not metal but the very stillness that made creation possible. The forge had entered that deep and sacred lull in which every breath of flame, every creak of stone, and every flicker of shadow felt intentional, as though the very space were holding its own meditation. Hephaestus, still seated near the low mouth of the main hearth, remained motionless for several long minutes, not out of idleness, but out of profound alignment with the rhythm of the room. The world outside, Olympus, mortals, myths, all of it seemed so far removed that it might as well belong to a different reality altogether. Here, in this place of iron and embers, there was only the now. Rising slowly, the god walked across the wide floor, his bare feet making the faintest scuffing sounds against the warm stone, toward a tall slab of volcanic rock propped upright in the far end of the forge. This slab had no purpose except the one he had given it, a surface for imprinting thoughts not with words but with texture. Its face was rough and uneven, but Hephaestus had spent years pressing objects into it. The rounded back of a hammer, the edge of a file, the corner of a gear, the curve of a spoon handle, even the palm of his own hand. Over time, the surface had become a tapestry of impressions, shallow, irregular, random in placement, but deeply familiar. He approached it now with a small copper pin in hand, gently heating its tip over a lantern flame until it glowed the faintest red, then pressing it lightly into the rock to leave a clean, round mark near the upper right edge. Not large, not even particularly visible unless one was standing close, but new and therefore necessary. This was not a message to others. This was how he spoke to the forge itself, a language of shapes, a record of presence. When he stepped back and looked over the entire slab, his eyes wandered from mark to mark as if reading a story that no one else would ever understand. And perhaps that was the point. Some stories were not meant to be told. They were meant to be lived, to be remembered by the space in which they occurred. He turned from the wall and walked toward one of the oldest chests in the forge, an arched container of dark oak, so worn with age that the lid barely held its curve. Inside were lengths of leather and hide, each piece tanned and treated not for beauty, but for endurance. He removed a thin sheet of pale leather and carried it to his workbench, where he laid it flat and pinned the corners to the surface with small brass weights. Then, using a simple stylus, he began drawing again. Slow arcs, looping lines, shapes that began with no end in mind. Unlike the stone impressions, these would fade over time. Leather absorbed oil from the fingers, absorbed breath and light, and heat, and the lines would blur, would stretch, would disappear. But for now they were here, and that too was a kind of permanence. The fire behind him murmured its approval, crackling in small bursts, then falling back into soft breath. From time to time he would pause and simply listen, not to evaluate, not to measure, but to honor. The god of flame had no desire to dominate fire. He wished only to understand it, to reflect it, to be near enough that it never felt alone. He finished the final curve on the leather and unpinned it, rolling it gently into a soft scroll and placing it in a shallow groove carved into the bench's edge. He did not label it. He did not title the design. It was not a pattern, but a moment captured in motion. Hephaestus rubbed his hands together slowly, feeling the residual warmth from the stylus, then brushed the dust from his robe with absent-minded precision. Around him everything stood in a kind of watchful hush. The objects, the walls, even the air. The forge was not a workshop. It was a memory chamber, and he, its only witness, its only priest. He walked once more to the basin, dipped his fingers in the spring and touched them lightly to his temples. Not in ritual, not in habit, but as a gesture of grounding. Cold to warmth, water to fire, soft to strong. Then he leaned against the wall beside the slab of impressions, arms folded, eyes half closed. There was no task calling to him, no creation demanding to be born. Just the quiet. The long, uninterrupted quiet that stretched like a river under moonlight, unmoving, unbothered, infinite in its peace. There was a stillness in the forge now that had gone beyond quiet. It was the kind of stillness that only arrived after long hours of harmony between thought and motion, where nothing more was required from the hands or the mind, and even the fire seemed to rest in contemplation, rather than in hunger. Hephaestus moved through this atmosphere with the careful grace of someone who had not only built the space, but had become part of it, his presence as natural as the curve of the stone walls or the low thrum of the embers beneath the hearth. Today, his attention turned to the farthest corner of the forge, where a shallow alcove had been carved into the bedrock and lined with old linen, faded, soot-stained cloth folded and refolded over years, forming makeshift cushions and wraps for fragile objects never meant for completion. He knelt there now, brushing aside a draped corner to reveal a wooden tray containing small figures he had begun long ago and never finished. These were not gods or beasts or legendary tools. They were plain and modest, hints of animals, glimpses of human forms, gestures frozen in the earliest stages of shaping. A half-formed bird with one wing, a seated woman whose face had never been carved, a coiled serpent made of twisted bronze that ended abruptly mid-tail. He lifted each in turn, studying them not for flaw or potential, but for memory, for the whisper of the moment in which he had begun them. Each fragment had come into being not because it was needed, but because he had wanted to feel the texture of bronze, the softness of lead, the resistance of stone. These were moments made tangible, like breaths cast into form. Gently he selected the half-formed bird and placed it on a nearby bench beside a new block of soapstone, then took up a small rasp and began to file the underside of its wing, not to finish it, but to give it balance so it might sit without tipping. The motion was slow, repetitive, almost meditative, the rasp singing softly against the metal, sending faint whispers of dust into the warm air. As he worked, he thought not of the bird's final shape, but of how it felt to hold it. The weight shifted slightly in his palm. The way the metal had cooled over the years, losing its forge heat but gaining a quiet warmth from time when the shape felt right, not perfect but content. He stopped and set it down beside a small piece of clay that once might have become its mate. Hephaestus then reached for a thread of thin copper wire and wrapped it loosely around the bird's neck, not as decoration, but as a gesture of acknowledgement, a touch, a signature of sorts. He placed the bird on a raised shelf made of driftwood he had once pulled from the sea foam far below Olympus, where salt still lingered in the cracks. The shelf was home to other such fragments, objects never named, never known to anyone but him. They watched silently as they always had, from their perch near the ceiling where the heat gathered and shadows lengthened. He stepped back, exhaled through his nose, and brushed the filing dust from his fingers with a rag that had once belonged to the wrapping of a divine spear now lost to legend. There was no sentimentality in the motion, only familiarity. He returned to the alcove, folded the linen wraps back into place, and sat for a while beside them. The floor beneath him was warm but not hot, smooth from decades of quiet use, and he leaned his shoulder against the wall, allowing himself to listen again, not for voices nor visions, but for the absence of them. In that absence lived the forge's wisdom, not told through commands or symbols, but through the endless permission it granted him to simply be, to make when he felt like making, to rest when the silence grew long, to revisit what was half-shaped without shame. The bird did not fly, the woman did not speak, the serpent did not coil, but all of them belonged. And in this soft, fire-lit corner of eternity, belonging was enough. As the quiet hours continued to unfold like the gentle roll of smoke, drifting upward from the heart of the forge, Hephaestus found himself once again in the slow rhythm of thought that had no destination, only presence. The embers glowed low and rich behind him, their heat no longer urgent but settled into a kind of faithful hum, like the breathing of something alive and resting. The god walked with deliberate slowness to one of the narrower niches carved deep into the forge's stone flank, a small storage recess behind a half-curtained wall of woven reeds, their edges darkened over time by soot and age. He pushed them aside gently, revealing a collection of small vessels arranged in no particular order. Round clay pots, shallow bowls of bronze, squat jars capped with beeswax, and a single alabaster vial with a hairline crack through its middle. These vessels held pigments, dust ground from stones not found on Olympus or in any mortal mine, but gathered from forgotten places in the in-between. The ochres from volcanic shores where time passed sideways, the greens born of cave lichen, bathed in mineral mists, the soft grays from the base of thunderclouds compressed into ash. Hephaestus selected a flat ceramic palette, wiped it clean with a worn cloth, and spooned a small measure of powder from each vessel, careful not to let them mix. He added only a drop of oil to each pile, mixing them slowly with a tapered bone rod until the colors thickened into usable pastes. Then, from a ledge beneath the window slit, he retrieved a small, flat slate tile and placed it before him on a table stained from centuries of quiet creation. What he painted was not a picture, not a scene or a story. It was a slow layering of curves, loops, and shadows, a meditation in color. He applied each stroke with careful stillness, letting the texture speak more than the shape. A wide arc of faded blue here, a soft wash of pale rust there. Circles formed and disappeared. Some lines ended without reaching their neighbor. The tile began to carry a kind of mood, a whisper of fog over hillside, or the echo of heat rising from stone at dusk, but it remained formless, nameless, and whole. When he paused, he tilted the tile toward the low firelight, watching the pigment catch the orange glow and fall again into dim. He didn't analyze the image. He didn't evaluate. He simply observed. Once dry, he placed the tile in a row with others like it along a ridge of blackened shelf just above the soot line. Tiles he had painted on other days like this, each holding its own silent weight, its own echo of a moment when movement needed no direction. As he returned the palette and pigments to their jars, he felt the quiet deepen. It was a familiar kind of deepening, the kind that signaled not an end, but a gentle descent into the most sacred layer of stillness the forge could offer. He sat again, but this time on a low cushion near the automaton, which hummed faintly as always, its breath slow and perfect. The automaton had never moved, never spoken, never needed winding or fuel, yet it remained a constant, like a presence left behind by memory, neither guardian nor servant, but companion. Hephaestus looked at it for a long while, not expecting anything, but finding comfort in the echo of his craftsmanship reflected in the smooth metal curves and resting posture. He reached forward and adjusted a tiny hinge in the figure's shoulder. Not broken, not stiff, just slightly misaligned, perhaps from the stone cooling unevenly beneath it over the years. With 2 fingers and a whisper of pressure, he shifted the joint back into balance. There was no click, no spark, only a soft return to symmetry. Then he leaned back again and rested, arms folded across his lap, head gently tipped toward the fire. Around him, the forge exhaled in creaks and sighs. The pigments dried, the tiles cooled, the vessels slept, and the god, wrapped in a silence that had become more than sound, let himself drift, not into sleep, not into dreams, but into the glowing center of a moment that asked nothing but to be felt. Within the slow-moving breath of the forge, where flame had long since quieted to a pulse and even shadows seemed to hesitate before moving across stone, Hephaestus rose once more, not because duty called, nor inspiration stirred, but simply because the space invited motion the way a river invites a leaf. His feet made no sound on the warm floor, and his path curved gently toward the corner where a simple tool wall stood. No grand armory of celestial hammers or divine tongs, but a modest arrangement of frequently used implements. Awls, chisels, clamps, and burnishers hung from hooks like resting limbs. Many had handles worn smooth by centuries of touch, their metal ends dulled not by misuse but by long familiarity. He ran a hand along the row, feeling each tool before selecting a narrow, double-ended stylus. One side pointed, the other gently, rounded, and carried it to a work table where an untouched sheet of soft tin lay waiting. The tin was not chosen for its value, but for its character. It bent easily, carried the warmth of a hand longer than other metals, and responded to the smallest gestures. He placed it before him and began to draw, not with ink, not with pigment, but with pressure, scoring the surface gently with the stylus's blunt end. He moved slowly, not crafting symbols but tracing thought itself. Long, wavering lines that curved back on themselves, spirals that hesitated mid-turn, arcs that intersected like overlapping memories. There was no plan. The sheet became a record of presence rather than an image. At times he would stop, lift the stylus, press his fingers against the tin as though feeling its response. Not for heat, not for flaw, just for connection. The forge. Around him remained steady, its light dim but whole, casting an amber sheen across the surface, deepening the etched lines with every flicker. In the background, the breathing automaton released a faint mechanical sigh, and from a vent above a thread of cool air slipped through, brushing past his shoulders like a reminder that the world beyond the forge continued, though it held no claim over this moment. When the etching felt complete, though there had been no goal, Hephaestus turned the tin plate in his hands and ran a cloth across it, not to erase the marks, but to smooth their edges, to let the indentations settle into their material like footprints hardened in clay. He then slid the plate onto a rack beside other similar works, each a whisper of a thought, a fragment of time captured not in artistry, but in attention. Beside the rack stood a jar filled with fine wire offcuts, thin curls and shavings that had once fallen unnoticed during the shaping of larger works. He selected a few, warmed them over a small flame, and pressed them into the edges of the tin sheet, letting them adhere without solder, just softened metal, meeting softened metal, as if joining out of choice rather than force. The additions added nothing functional. They were not adornment. They were simply part of the gesture. He stepped back and looked at the piece once more, then turned away, not to walk far, but to sit on a low ledge built into the forge wall, a resting spot long worn into a seat by the weight of his own body over uncounted seasons. There, he rested, his arms on his knees, fingers still tingling slightly from the metal's residual heat. He stared not at the work, but at the space around it, the surface of the table bearing fine scratches from countless projects, the ledge above where a half-melted candle leaned, the floor where soot had gathered like drifting snow in the corners. Every detail, every object, every mark, held the quiet history of a god who had created not out of grandeur, but out of endurance. The forge did not need glory. It needed presence. It needed the kind of devotion that paid attention to what others left behind. And so, in this small gesture etched in tin and touched with wire, Hephaestus had once again offered his presence to the forge, not loudly, not dramatically, but wholly. And the forge, in turn, accepted, holding the moment within its ever-patient heart. The atmosphere inside the forge had grown so dense with calm that even the air itself seemed to hesitate, reluctant to disturb the harmony that had settled into every beam, every crack in the stone, every tool left resting precisely where it had last been touched. Hephaestus stood near the center of the chamber where the firelight curved gently around his figure like a shawl of warmth and memory. No task beckoned. No divine commission loomed. There was, instead, a different sort of calling, a quiet impulse, to revisit an old corner of the forge, a side chamber long disused yet never abandoned. With steps as soft as smoke rising, he made his way across the floor, past the maze basin, past the automaton's eternal vigil, and through a narrow doorway partially obscured by trailing ivy that had grown down through a forgotten ceiling crack, its green leaves catching bits of the forge's amber glow. This chamber was smaller, less formal, more intimate, as if carved not to impress or produce, but to shelter. The walls here bore the marks of early work, crude impressions, half-carved lines, scorch marks from when the fire had once burned, too wildly, back when the forge was young and so was he. In the center of this space stood a square table made of thick, uneven planks joined by iron nails, their heads worn down to silver ovals by centuries of brushing hands. On it lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, its surface darkened and patched. He untied it slowly, unfolding the layers with reverence, revealing a project left untouched for longer than memory could measure. A mechanical bird, unlike the elegant one resting in the main forge, this one heavier, more geometric, its parts angular and slightly misaligned. It had been one of his first experiments in combining breath and bronze, a prototype for what would become a later, smoother version. But this one had never been finished, not because of failure, but because other tasks had pulled him away. He lifted it gently, parts clinking faintly in his hands, and placed it on the table. Its wings were stiff, one gear missing, and its internal coils had long since cooled into rusted stillness. Yet there was a weight to it that made it feel alive, not in motion, but in presence. He took a cloth and began to polish it slowly, not to restore its shine, but to reacquaint his hands with its shape. He turned it carefully, running fingers over seams, noting where effort had once concentrated, where hesitation had lingered. He reached for a small, double-sided file and began to gently smooth the base of its neck, where a ridge had always been slightly too sharp. As metal filings curled away like silver thread, he let his thoughts wander, back to the day he first thought a bird might breathe, back to the moment he had realized that breath need not mean air but rhythm. When the surface felt even, he stopped, not bothering to replace the missing gear or adjust the misaligned wing. He wasn't here to fix it. He was here to remember what it meant to begin. He placed the bird on a shallow wooden tray beside a small bowl filled with dried olive leaves, leaves he had once tucked into the corners of this chamber, back when he believed scent and sound must accompany invention. The scent had faded now, leaving only the fragile crinkle of their forms. He added a few more from a pouch kept in a nearby alcove and watched as they settled around the bird like a nest of memory. Then, turning from the table, he ran his hand along the chamber wall, touching the marks left by flame and time, burns, scratches, soot that no cleaning had ever erased. This too was part of his work. Not the polish, not the perfect product, but the trace of persistence. The flame flickered lower now, casting longer shadows that danced across the walls like echoes of movements long since stilled. He stood in the doorway for a moment before returning to the main chamber, pausing to glance back only once, not to judge or regret, but to thank. He stepped into the open warmth of the forge again, the familiar hum of embers greeting him like an old friend. He exhaled, long and slow, and resumed his slow circuit of the space, walking not toward task or output, but simply because it felt right to move, to let motion carry him gently forward in the silence he had spent centuries shaping. In this rhythm, even the past had a place, not behind him, but beside. The forge, ancient and steady, now seemed to breathe in a slower rhythm than ever before, its warmth having settled into the deepest layers of the stone, the metal, and the very air, creating a quiet so immersive it felt like a sound unto itself, a low, constant hum of continuity. Hephaestus, moving through this silence, reached a part of the forge rarely visited, not because it was hidden, but because it required a different kind of attention. This space, located just beyond a gently sloped corridor, had no workbench, no tools, no fire. It was a chamber of raw material, simple blocks of marble, sheets of hammered bronze, bundles of wood carefully stacked by grain type, lengths of rope and linen, baskets of clay lumps kept moist with damp cloth. There were no labels, no shelves, just ordered presence, a kind of sacred stillness in potential. Hephaestus entered with slow steps, the soft shuffle of his feet raising tiny puffs of dust that floated for a moment in the golden light coming from a high, narrow slit carved into the rock above. Here he did not act as a smith or sculptor. Here he acted as a listener, standing amidst the unshaped with the humility of one who knows creation is not conquest, but conversation. He ran his fingers along a piece of cedar, its edge rough and knotty, and paused beside a stack of soapstone, its matte surface cool beneath his palm. He picked up a small lump of clay and held it in both hands, turning it slowly, not pressing or shaping, but letting it speak to him through weight and moisture. The clay had no story yet, and that was its power. After several moments, he placed it back gently as if placing a sleeping creature onto its bed, then walked to a pile of scrap, metal that had been bent, scorched, cracked, or otherwise made, unsuitable for delicate work. Hephaestus never threw such pieces away. They carried a different value, memories of error, yes, but also of effort, risk, learning. He selected a curved sliver of bronze, its surface mottled and scorched, and examined it closely under the slanted beam of daylight. With a soft cloth, he wiped away the residue of soot and ash to reveal an inner gleam that had not dulled entirely. It caught the light just enough to remind him why even flawed things must be kept. He set the bronze aside and gathered a few other fragments, arranging them on a nearby stone ledge in a loose, spiraling pattern, not as a sculpture, not as art, but as a way of seeing them again. He sat beside the ledge on a low block of granite and simply watched, the firelight from the forge proper glowing faintly behind him through the corridor, its warmth just enough to temper the cool air of the storage chamber. As the fragments lay there casting soft shadows, he thought of all the things he had never made, all the ideas that had never left his hands, not because he lacked time or talent, but because not everything asked to be made. Some ideas were content to remain in material form, unshaped, waiting, offering their essence in silence. Hephaestus leaned forward and touched one of the fragments, a broken piece of gear that had once been part of a failed automaton, running, his thumb across its jagged end and feeling not regret but tenderness. In this place nothing failed, nothing ended. All things rested. The forge accepted even what was unfinished, incomplete, forgotten. He stood again and looked around one last time before exiting the room, his eyes tracing the outlines of the stored wood, the coils of rope, the half-used sheets of copper. All of it waiting, all of it patient, all of it in some way already part of him. Returning to the main forge, he passed through the archway where warm and cool air mingled briefly, brushing his skin with contrast. He stopped at the center of the room, turned toward the fire, and took a deep breath, letting it fill his chest slowly. There was nothing to prove, nothing to display. In this hour, surrounded by remnants and raw beginnings, Hephaestus felt most complete. Not in the grandeur of achievement, but in the fullness of preparation, in the quiet presence of what might one day become. And that was enough. Evening, if it could be called that in a forge without sun or moon, had arrived in the softest way possible, through the dimming of flames to a gentle pulse, through the cooling of iron that no longer hissed under water, through the long, slow breath of a space that had worked and watched and waited for longer than any clock could measure. Hephaestus remained in the heart of this space, unmoving for a long while. Not asleep, not lost, simply present. His posture easy, hands resting upon his lap, fingers still marked with soot and the faint sheen of oil. There was no end of day, ritual here. No definitive moment when work ceased and rest began. The forge did not recognize shifts or schedules. It only responded to intention. And tonight intention had shifted toward reflection. The god moved toward one of the oldest walls of the chamber, where a wide slab of dark basalt served as both archive and altar. Upon this surface were set dozens of small carvings, simple tokens made across centuries, all from different materials, but united by a certain softness and design. They were not depictions of battle nor emblems of power. They were impressions of quiet things: a curved feather, a curled leaf, a shallow bowl, a single wave, a flame that bent instead of roaring upward. These carvings were not labeled. Their meaning was not meant to be interpreted. They simply were. Hephaestus picked one up, a small ivory circle carved with the lightest touch to resemble a sleeping eye, the lid resting over no pupil. He rolled it in his hand thoughtfully, its smooth surface warm from the ambient heat of the forge. Then, in a gesture so subtle it felt ceremonial, he placed it in a bowl beside the slab where a few other pieces rested, tokens that had been retired, not discarded, but allowed to sleep. He turned from the altar and walked to a different corner of the forge, where a small stool sat before a basin. Not the spring-fed pool, but a wide, shallow stone dish filled with ash. This was where he came when he wished to mark time without recording it. Sitting slowly, he dipped his fingers into the ash and pressed them lightly onto a flat tile beside him, leaving 5 smudges. Uneven, faint, but unmistakably his. Then he wiped his fingers clean with a dry cloth and placed the tile onto a growing stack near the base of the wall. Each tile bore a unique set of prints, none identical, some overlapping slightly, others clean and separate. The pile was not arranged, nor was it counted. It was simply allowed to grow. Nearby, a set of narrow brass wind chimes stirred ever, so slightly, caught by the breath of air that occasionally slipped through the high vent in the stone. Their tones were not melodic. They rang softly, irregularly, each note landing like a drop into a still pool. Hephaestus turned his head at the sound, not startled but reminded of the forge's aliveness, of the quiet conversations between stone, flame, metal, and air. He rose, stretched his arms slowly, and crossed to the long central bench, placing both palms flat against its surface. The wood was blackened with use, its grain no longer visible, but its strength unshaken. He had stood at this bench more times than he could recall, shaping, melting, cooling, engraving, and now he simply stood again, not to begin, not to conclude, but to witness. Around him, tools rested in silence. The automaton remained still, in its timeless breath. A layer of fine dust had begun to settle over the less used shelves, and the maize basin, though still filled with water, reflected no movement. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the heat of the forge settle deeper into his chest. There was nothing urgent. No voices called, no visions intruded, just the subtle gravity of a place that had always known him better than any god or mortal ever could. He opened his eyes, took a final breath for the hour, and let it out slowly, like cooling metal, like extinguishing light, and returned to his seat near the flickering lantern, not to think or plan, but to sit, as flame sits, in its own glow. Nothing more was needed. In the forge of the forgotten and the unfinished, in the temple of repetition and reverence, Hephaestus had once again made something without shape, something called peace. The forge did not sleep, though it rested. It did not dream, though its walls remembered. By the time Hephaestus stirred from his stool once again, the air had cooled just slightly, still warm enough to comfort bare skin, but laced now with a gentler hush, as though the heat itself had curled inward to nap. The god of fire and craft moved slowly, not from weariness, but because slowness had become the nature of the place, a rhythm earned through centuries of deliberate work. His steps brought him to a narrow shelf carved directly into the stone wall above a forgotten vent, where the air moved just enough to rustle a hanging strip of aged linen. Upon this shelf lay a series of bundled scrolls, none inscribed with language, but all etched with the weight of process. These scrolls, unrolled, revealed not diagrams but traces, rubbings of surfaces, experimental textures, patterns made from pressing leaves, rope, hammered shells, and sometimes even his own fingerprints into soft clay or wax before imprinting them onto long strips of hide or cloth. He selected one at random and gently unrolled it across a wide, flat slab of bronze that had long served as a surface for quiet contemplation. The cloth unfurled slowly, the folds releasing faint whiffs of smoke, oil, and time. What lay revealed was a series of overlapping circular impressions, each slightly different in depth and width, forming an almost hypnotic pattern that resembled ripples on a still pond or the breath marks left by a sleeping creature. Hephaestus pressed both palms flat onto the surface of the cloth and closed his eyes, not for trance or vision, but for alignment, for the feeling of his body resting against something that had once recorded his hands in motion. After several breaths, he removed his hands and reached for a small disk of charcoal stored in a lidded jar nearby. Carefully, he began dusting the impressions, not to darken them but to accentuate their subtlety, making their edges clearer to the eye. This was not for art. This was for awareness. He continued until the whole scroll bore a soft film of gray, and then, slowly, he rolled it back into its familiar form and placed it at the end of the shelf, farther along than it had ever sat before. His way of marking that it had been revisited, honored, and allowed to return to rest. Beside the shelf stood a narrow bench with an inlaid trough containing cooled sand mixed with ash. From this trough, Hephaestus retrieved a handful and sprinkled it over the bronze slab, where the warmth still lingered faintly from long use. The mixture hissed softly where it touched. Then he smoothed it across the surface with the flat of his palm, until the metal glowed dully beneath the layer. It was a ritual not for cleansing but for grounding, returning the surface to neutrality, wiping away memory not as erasure, but as completion. Around him, the forge remained in its sacred pause. Nothing cried out to be made. Nothing demanded purpose. He stepped away from the slab and toward the center of the room again, where the embers, now dim, glowed in deep orange rather than fire-bright gold. With a long iron rod, he stirred them gently, not to reignite, but to keep the heart of the forge pulsing. The embers shifted, collapsed inward, sighed. Sparks rose briefly and disappeared into the dark arches above, where the stone caught their light and swallowed it in silence. He set the rod aside and rubbed his hands together, then pressed his palms to his chest, feeling the warmth within his own skin echo the heat of the forge. There was no separation anymore, between the place and the maker, between the tool and the hand, between the thought and the thing. He was not working. He was not resting. He was simply with the forge, and it was with him. A soft sound, like the smallest clink of settling metal, rang out from a distant shelf. Hephaestus turned, but did not search. The forge often spoke in such ways, subtle, unsummoned, not asking, only reminding that it was alive, aware, continuing. He walked once more around the central space, past the maze basin, past the dust-lined rack of tools, and stopped before the mirror that never gave a true reflection. It shimmered faintly now, not with light but with movement, its surface wavering just enough to reveal not his face, but the glow of the forge behind him. He watched for a moment, then raised one finger and drew a circle onto the mirror's surface, fogging it slightly. The circle remained, then slowly faded. He turned away, the silence deeper now than before, the hour stretching forward with no pressure. The forge would not close, the work would not call. For now there was only peace, and that was all he needed. By now the forge had reached that profound phase of stillness known only to places untouched by interruption, a depth of quiet that settled not only into the walls and tools, but into the air itself, making each breath drawn within its bounds feel sacred, slowed, and heavier with meaning. Hephaestus stood near the broad arch of the outer corridor, the place where the forge opened briefly toward the world beyond, not in exposure but in suggestion, where a soft draft of air occasionally slipped in, bearing the dry scent of distant stone and the cooler breath of unshaped space. He did not cross the threshold. He never did. That boundary marked the edge of the forge's dominion, not through force, but through understanding. This was the world of flame and form, and stepping beyond it meant entering noise, narrative, and necessity. He remained where he was, his body framed against the subtle amber light, and watched the shadows stretch just slightly longer than before. In his hand, he held a fragment of old iron, worn, scarred, and slightly bent, a relic from a long disassembled mechanism whose purpose he no longer remembered, but whose presence remained curiously insistent. He had picked it up that evening, not out of utility, but out of a need to carry something shaped and imperfect. As he turned it between his fingers, the piece caught the forge light in uneven flashes as if trying to speak, though its language was long lost. Rather than attempt to decode it, Hephaestus honored its silence, running a cloth over its surface with slow, deliberate motion, not to polish it, but to acknowledge its time. After a few moments, he placed it carefully into a shallow tray filled with other fragments, broken hinges, snapped threads of wire, half-melted bolts, all items once dismissed, now resting like aged companions. Beside the tray was a small square slab of slate that he often used when words were needed, though not spoken. He picked up a white chalk nub and traced a slow spiral on its surface, beginning in the center and working outward until the spiral filled the stone. He did not label it. He did not explain it. But when it was done, he leaned the slab upright against the wall as if the spiral needed to face the forge to fully exist. Then, with a soft breath, he returned to the central workspace. The fire, still low, had reached the state Hephaestus most loved, a pulsing, rhythmic glow that cast no sudden flickers, only steady illumination. He pulled a small wooden stool toward the fire and sat, not to work but to observe. Before him sat a single small anvil, unadorned, unengraved, its surface flat and cold from disuse. He reached into a pouch at his belt and retrieved a small object no larger than his thumb. A gear, delicately made, with teeth only slightly misaligned. It had never found its place in any mechanism, always rejected in final assembly, always returned to the pouch. Now, in this hour of gentle retreat, Hephaestus set the gear on the anvil and stared at it. He was not planning to fix it, he was simply giving it time. Around them, the forge watched silently. Shadows moved only slightly with the occasional stir of warm air. The tools remained hanging in perfect stillness. The automaton had not shifted. The maze basin reflected only the faintest ripple of movement from a high vent. Everything had aligned into a state of patient watching, and Hephaestus, god of fire, builder of wonders, master of craft, sat in the center of it all, watching too, watching a gear that had never worked, on an anvil that had not been struck, under a flame that asked nothing more of him than to be still. He traced a fingertip along the edge of the gear, not to test its sharpness, but to remember how long it had existed unused. Perhaps tomorrow he would repurpose it, perhaps not. Perhaps it would remain just as it was, a small circle of effort and error that had simply outlasted its original purpose. That, too, was worthy of reverence. In the forge, no moment was wasted. no object meaningless. All things, even those undone, belonged. The fire hummed low, the shadows agreed, and Hephaestus, seated in perfect stillness, let the moment stretch, long and quiet, like cooling metal across the bones of time. Time moved differently in the forge, if it moved at all. It did not pass so much as settle, like dust gathering in the creases of old cloth or smoke curling into the grooves of hammered stone. Hephaestus, now deep into this unmeasured stretch of night or memory or quiet, remained at the edge of action, somewhere between reflection and motion. His hands rested in his lap, but his mind roamed gently, visiting shapes and sounds that had once filled the forge in more industrious hours. He was not recalling specific days or finished works, but textures, how bronze felt against a rasp at the start of a long grind, how ash settled between fingers after extinguishing a piece, how the weight of a cooling sword balanced in the palm, even before its edge had been tested. The forge, responding to his stillness, grew quieter still, as if honoring this inward gaze. Behind him, the faint gurgle of the maze basin marked the only movement, water tracing paths long worn into the stone. The sound reminded Hephaestus of something older than even this forge, of the first time he had learned to cool metal not with haste but with care, letting steam rise in spirals rather than bursts, learning that even flame had moods. With a slow breath he rose and crossed to a niche in the wall that held nothing but a single stone bowl filled with obsidian shards. These shards were remnants from tools shattered long ago, some broken by mistake, others by force, and a few simply given over to time. Each fragment had sharp edges and caught the light in strange ways, their glossy black surfaces sometimes reflecting more than they should. He reached in and took one, weighing it gently, then ran his thumb along its edge, not enough to cut, but enough to feel the precision of its fracture. This shard had once been the tip of a carving knife, he remembered, broken when it struck a pocket of unseen air inside a stubborn block of marble. Rather than discard it, he had saved the piece, not for repair, but for acknowledgement. He set it down beside a pile of other fragments and gathered a small set of flat wooden sticks, each one scorched slightly at one end. These sticks were not for stirring or shaping. They were markers, stand-ins for moments. He dipped one into a bowl of ash water and made a single line across the center of the obsidian piece, a faint gray mark that dried quickly. Then he placed the shard atop a slab at the back of the niche, joining others marked in the same way. It was a quiet ceremony he had never explained to anyone, and never would. These were not failures. These were closures. Not every object finished its journey the way it was planned. Some ended early but still mattered. Stepping away, he made his way back to the central hearth, now dim and pulsing like the embered heart of a giant creature asleep. There, beside the fire, sat a small sealed jar of oil with a single wick inside, something more symbolic than functional. Hephaestus lit it with a strand of glowing wire, and the flame that emerged was soft, golden and steady, casting no wild flicker but creating a gentle halo that rested calmly on the wall. He placed the jar on a ledge, letting the light join, the forge without overwhelming it, a companion more than a source. Then he sat again, not at the table nor the bench but on the floor itself, cross-legged, spine relaxed, gaze unfocused, as the warmth wrapped around him like an old story returning to its teller. He did not think of gods or thrones, of weapons or palaces. He thought only of heat and time and the endless dignity of things left incomplete. A curl of metal on the floor caught his eye, something that had fallen days ago and never been retrieved. He picked it up and held it for a while, then placed it in a groove carved into the stone beside him, a resting place shaped by hundreds of such gestures. Every object in this forge, even the ones untouched for centuries, had been placed with intention, and tonight was no different. In the deep, slow hush of this moment, Hephaestus gave himself fully to stillness, not because he was tired, but because the forge had asked nothing more. And so, together, God and flame, stone and soot, watched time unspool like thread from a wheel that never spun, only turned inward, deeper and deeper into peace. The forge had grown so accustomed to quiet that even the smallest action now echoed like a memory returning to itself. A breath drawn, a tool shifted, the hush of cloth, against stone. All these became part of the chamber's language, as familiar as fire but softer than silence. Hephaestus rose slowly from the floor, joints moving with the ease of one long attuned to rest and rhythm, and walked toward the low alcove where he kept the most unusual pieces of his work. Not the masterpieces meant for gods, nor the gears that once turned in secret mechanisms, but the experiments that had never been finished, ideas born in solitude and allowed to remain that way. The alcove was dimly lit by a single oil lamp whose flame leaned lazily against the curve of the wall, casting shadows that moved like slow thoughts. Inside the recess, arranged on thick felt and linen, were small constructions made of unusual combinations. Stone joined to metal with invisible seams, glass spheres partially filled with sand that never settled, coils of bronze that twisted in impossible spirals, each an exploration rather than a solution. Hephaestus picked up a delicate object shaped like a half-closed flower, each petal forged from thin sheets of tin, their edges bent inward as though listening. At its center was a stone, unremarkable, dark but heavy for its size, resting, in place without fastener or weight. He turned the object gently in his hands, letting the petals shift and clink with soft notes that had no melody but a certain peace. This was one of the objects he had made not for function but for feeling, for the act of creating something whose purpose was presence. He placed it back and studied the others. A cube of marble wrapped in a net of silver wire, a ring of copper, too thin to wear, a tiny hourglass where the sand fell upward instead of down, held by some trick of magnetism or divine whim. These were his secrets, not hidden but not explained, pieces that needed no story and offered no claim to greatness. In the forge, they were not judged. They simply existed. He selected the cube this time, holding it up to the lamplight and watching how the silver caught the glow. The metal was tarnished, but it didn't matter. Its beauty came from being made, not from being admired. He sat again on the ledge beneath the alcove and rested the cube on his knee. The warmth of the forge touched his skin, but more gently now, as if the flame itself had learned to respect the quiet. Hephaestus thought about the nature of invention, not as brilliance or divine spark, but as endurance, the patient shaping of material until it revealed something of itself. Many of his greatest works had begun without vision, only curiosity. And now, surrounded by the remnants of that curiosity, he felt a rare stillness settle over him. Not the stillness of exhaustion, but of completion. Not everything needed to become something more. Sometimes the act of making was enough. He stood once more and returned the cube to its place, brushing a soft cloth over the felt as he did so, as though tucking the object in for sleep. He turned, down the lamp, its flame shrinking to a small orange point before vanishing into wick and darkness. The shadows deepened, but they did not press inward. They welcomed him. He crossed the forge with no destination in mind, his fingers trailing across surfaces familiar beyond thought. Each tool, each bench, each stone had its own memory, its own moment when it had mattered most. And yet all remained equal in this quiet hour. He paused before the maze basin, its water still, reflecting only a dim shimmer from the embers beyond. He dipped his fingers in and let them rest there for a moment. The water was cool, the contrast soft against the heat of his skin, a symbol perhaps of the balance he had long tended, between fire and form, between force and finesse, between divine expectation and the quiet necessity of craft. Withdrawing his hand, he let the droplets fall to the floor in silence. Then, at last, he returned to his usual place near the fire. The embers pulsed steadily like a heartbeat that needed no body. He sat, not to work, not to think, but to be, as metal is, as stone is, as the forge is when left in perfect peace. And, in that peace, Hephaestus remained, surrounded by what he had made and what he had left unmade, whole in the stillness of his endless hour. The forge had taken on the texture of a memory suspended in time, thick with warmth, dim with light, and filled with a presence that didn't need form to be felt. No longer day or night, It existed now in a liminal state where hours bled into one another like molten metal poured into a basin with no edges. Hephaestus, moving once again with the unhurried grace of someone who had shed urgency, returned to the narrow corridor that led to a seldom-used alcove carved into the very spine of the mountain. It was a place so deep within the rock, that sound, barely carried and light arrived only in suggestion, filtered through the glow of a small eternal coal burning in a bronze cradle mounted to the wall. Here, no large tools were kept, no fire roared. It was a chamber of subtlety, a space reserved for work that required not force, but listening. At the center sat a small pedestal, atop which rested a shallow ceramic bowl filled with crushed minerals, ground to fine powder by stones worn smooth from centuries of use. The colors were pale, whites, grays, the softest pinks, like faded thoughts gathered in one place. Hephaestus knelt beside the pedestal and dipped 2 fingers into the powder, drawing a slow winding line across the stone floor. The gesture had no meaning beyond the moment, but it connected him to something older than the forge itself. The act of marking, of signaling one's presence through pattern. He continued until the floor bore a quiet spiral, nearly invisible in the low light, and then brushed his hands clean over a small vessel of sand nearby. Rising, he approached a narrow shelf carved into the rear wall, where sat a single object under a linen cloth, an unfinished medallion, circular in shape, with a hollow center where a gem had never been placed. The metal was darkened from age, and the etchings along its rim were faint, interrupted by hesitations he remembered well. It had been started during a season of distraction, when divine demands had pulled him too many directions at once. And though it had never been completed, he had kept it here, not out of regret, but reverence for what it could have been. He lifted it gently, held it up to the amber light, and turned it slowly in his fingers. The hollow center stared back at him like an eye that never closed. He did not intend to finish it tonight. He merely wanted to remind himself that it still existed, that the pause in its creation had not been failure, but care. Placing it back with tenderness, he turned toward a low stone bench set beneath a crescent-shaped overhang, where tiny mineral threads glittered faintly in the dark. Hephaestus sat and leaned back, his palms resting flat on either side of him, his posture open, eyes half closed. He listened. Not for voices or footsteps, there were none, but for the quiet mechanics of the forge itself, the faint clink of cooling metal expanding and contracting, the sigh of coals shifting in the far chamber, the occasional drop of condensed steam falling from high stone to deep basin. It was a symphony composed only for the one who had built it, and in it, he heard peace. After some time, he stood again, and left the medallion undisturbed, walking back through the corridor into the larger chamber where warmth welcomed him like an old friend. He passed a wide slab used for shaping divine alloys, its surface now cold, but still marked with the shallow outlines of projects long completed. He placed his hand on it for a moment and let memory rise. The hum of heated metal, the glow of new invention, the unspoken satisfaction of completion. Yet tonight none of that stirred him. He was not here to make, nor even to repair. He was here to remain. In the far corner, the automaton still sat, motionless and unbothered, a presence as steady as the forge itself. Hephaestus walked over, and sat beside it shoulder to metal shoulder and let out a breath that was neither heavy nor light, just real. The automaton made no sound, but something about its silence offered companionship. Perhaps that was what he had built into it long ago, without knowing. Not life, but presence. They sat like that for a while, the god and the thing he had once shaped, both unmoving, both understood by the space around them, and as the embers dimmed further, casting long, slow shadows across the chamber's soot-streaked walls, Hephaestus allowed himself to feel, fully and quietly, the stillness of a place that had given him everything he had never needed to ask for: warmth without demand, space without pressure, and time without end. The forge, now almost indistinguishable from a dream, existed in a kind of suspended dusk, where nothing moved quickly and every detail carried the weight of stillness. The fire had dulled to a quiet pulse, more glow than flame, and the stone itself radiated a slow warmth that seemed to come from the memory of heat rather than heat itself. Hephaestus wandered without intent through the space, as if led by instinct more than purpose, his bare feet making soft contact with the soot-dusted floor. His hands, though idle, still bore the fine traces of work. Charcoal at the tips, a nick across one knuckle, a faint shimmer of bronze residue where a tool had been gripped too tightly. But now the tools lay untouched. Tonight was not for shaping, but for attending, for honoring the slow passage of time in a place that had long transcended it. He passed a tall rack near the rear of the chamber, where lengths of wire, cord, and sinew hung like forgotten strings of an instrument never played. Each strand held its own story. Wire spun for automaton joints that were never assembled. Leather cords that once tethered bellows now long silent. Silken thread gathered from spiders that lived in the high vents of the forge's domed roof. He plucked one of the finer wires and let it fall between his fingers, feeling the tension, the potential, the possibility that had once drawn him to it. He wrapped it around his palm loosely, then set it on the edge of the stone bench and continued his quiet stroll. This time toward the smallest of his side workrooms, one rarely entered except when the forge itself felt too large, too filled, with echoes. This chamber was little more than a nook, carved roughly into the rock with walls that curved inward, creating the feeling of a cradle or a closed hand. Inside was only a small stool, a narrow window high above that allowed a blade of indirect light to fall across the floor, and a single shelf holding objects not of metal, but of earth. Clay figurines, baked and cracked, shaped by his hand during times when silence had felt heavier than even anvils. These were not gods, not monsters, not symbols. They were faces, some smiling faintly, others wide-eyed, one or two unfinished, their features smudged by a thumb in mid-gesture. He picked one up, the face of an old man, or perhaps a child, it was hard to tell, and turned it in the low light. Its expression had changed over time, molded not by touch but by the shifting play of shadows across its worn features. He placed it gently back and looked over the rest, hands behind his back, the way one does in a museum built not to impress, but to remember. For a moment he imagined they could speak, not to tell him what they were, but to tell him they still mattered. He stood there for a while before returning to the larger forge chamber, where the light had deepened further into amber, where the air had grown thick with the scent of cooling stone and resting metal. He moved slowly now, like someone walking, through a place not for the first time but for the thousandth, aware of every crack in the floor, every whisper of air from above. He passed the great anvil, once the heart of his work, and touched it lightly, not to rouse it but to thank it. Beside it lay a stack of old sketches, curled from the heat, drawn on hide and cloth. He didn't open them. He knew them by heart. Diagrams of impossible devices, maps of inner worlds, structural puzzles that had never been solved and likely never would be. They weren't blueprints. They were companions. He sat down on a low stone platform, one used in earlier days to rest pieces between phases of work, and leaned back slowly, letting his shoulders relax into the embrace of the stone. The ceiling above was barely visible now, lost in the haze of soft light and dust. Somewhere in the forge, a drop of condensation fell with a faint plink. Somewhere else, a spark settled into ash. Nothing called to be done. Nothing urged him forward. This hour belonged to the forge itself, to the quiet it had cultivated through years of companionship with its only constant guest. Hephaestus closed, his eyes not to sleep but to listen more deeply. The forge didn't speak in words. It spoke in pauses, in the way heat held a surface long after the flame had gone, in the way an object could hum even when untouched, in the way silence, when thick enough, could be mistaken for music. And in that music he rested, not to end the day but to become part of it, to fold into the breath of the place that had always, without question, welcomed him. The forge, now nearing the quiet climax of its longest night, had taken on the atmosphere of a sanctuary forgotten by time, no longer a place of action but of presence, of weightless existence where even thought moved slowly, folding inward like embers curling beneath their own ash. Hephaestus walked in silence along the inner wall where the oldest parts of the forge were still visible, rougher stone, untouched by polish, bearing the marks of the earliest fires and the soot of work done before he had mastered his craft. He traced a line along one jagged groove in the rock, remembering not the tool that had made it, but the state of mind, uncertain, determined, full of ideas too large for his hands but too stubborn to be left unshaped. These scars in the wall were not flaws. They were the beginnings of everything, beginnings of everything. A small shelf carved into the stone held a row of bone-handled tools, awls, chisels, and graving picks, most of them long retired, their edges dulled and their grips worn to softness. He lifted one gently, its handle curved from years of use, and turned it slowly in his palm. It was like holding a breath from another life. He returned it to its place and moved toward a central stone basin that had once served as a quenching trough, but now held only a shallow pool of clean water, still and dark like polished obsidian. He knelt beside it and gazed into its surface, seeing nothing distinct, just the suggestion of his shape rippling faintly. For a long while he remained there, letting the silence fold around him like a warm sheet. Then carefully, he dipped both hands into the basin and lifted the water to his face, letting it flow down his beard over his closed eyes, cooling the skin that had been nearest the fire for centuries. It was not a cleansing gesture. It was communion, an acknowledgement that even gods, even makers, needed pause. Rising, he crossed to the opposite end of the chamber, to a low alcove where pieces of once living things were stored, not morbidly, but reverently. Feathers collected from long-extinct birds that had once wandered the high cliffs near his mountain home, horn fragments from beasts shaped by divine whim but abandoned to natural time, bits of bark smoothed by the hands of children in villages long forgotten. Hephaestus opened a drawer and retrieved a single feather, long, gray, and fragile at the edges, then placed it in a narrow groove carved into the center of the table, where a draft from the vent above stirred it gently, as though the forge itself breathed through the small relic. He sat beside it, elbows on knees, watching the feather shift in place for what might have been minutes or hours. The forge made such things impossible to measure. Around him, the chamber's light dimmed further, not from lack of fuel, but because the forge knew how to rest, how to soften its own fire. Shadows lengthened but did not darken. They deepened, like ink spreading slowly through parchment, never overwhelming, only blending. Hephaestus stood once more and walked to the final space he had yet to visit in this long journey of stillness. A round room tucked behind the bellows chamber, rarely entered except in hours like these. It was windowless, quiet beyond quiet, its floor made of smooth volcanic glass. In its center stood a single low pedestal, and on it sat a sphere, featureless, dark, and faintly warm to the touch. This was not a device, not a creation, but a meditation, a symbol of everything that could be made, and everything that need not be. Hephaestus approached it and placed one hand on its surface. No pulse, no vibration, just warmth. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to breathe in its presence. It held no power, it gave no answers, but it reminded him that existence, in itself, was a form of creation. That choosing to remain, still silent, slow, was as valuable as forging swords for gods or gears for machines. After several moments, he lifted his hand and stepped away, leaving the sphere untouched. The round chamber, unchanged, seemed to bow in approval. He returned to the main forge, the warmth of the stone now more noticeable against the cooler air of the quiet corridors. The automaton sat unchanged. The fire dimmed. The tools slept. And Hephaestus, the eternal smith, sat again on the same bench he had used in the first hours of night. Around him, nothing had changed, yet everything had settled deeper into itself. More present, more still, more complete in its incompletion. In the rhythm of quiet breath and glowing ember, he became once again what he had always been, not merely the god of craft, but the keeper of patience. The forge now existed as a world unto itself, disconnected entirely from time's usual pace, no longer counting hours or measuring tasks, but existing in a state of soft suspension. like the gentle hum of a lullaby with no beginning or end. Everything within its stone-bounded sanctuary breathed slowly, if at all. The embers pulsed with a rhythm too subtle to see. The tools hung in perfect equilibrium, and even the shadows moved only when invited by flickers of light so faint they could almost be mistaken for memory. Hephaestus walked in silence, not with intent to work, but to witness, his steps barely audible against the soot-softened floor, each motion deliberate yet completely at ease. He approached the forge's northern alcove, where the oldest forge stones had never been replaced or carved smooth. A wall of rough basalt riddled with irregular holes and indentations, each one formed not by chisels, but by centuries of heat, pressure, and time. This wall was never used for work, it was used for watching. Whenever the god of the forge felt the burden of expectation pressing against his craft, he came here, where the stones offered nothing to shape and nothing to fix, only their presence, unyielding, unchanged, and quietly magnificent. Hephaestus placed both palms against the stone's rough face, feeling its texture beneath the calluses of his hands, letting it ground him in the stillness of the moment. He remained there for a long while, until the pressure in his chest dissolved and his breath found its slowest, deepest rhythm. Then, turning without a word, he walked to the work table nearest the hearth and opened a shallow drawer. Inside lay dozens of discarded sketches, some half-finished, others filled with meticulous lines, gears, hinges, and impossible mechanisms. But all of them abandoned not because they failed, but because they were not meant to be completed. They were thoughts in graphite and charcoal, allowed to exist without being judged. He spread a few across the table and studied them, not for inspiration, but for companionship. A diagram of a winged chariot powered by captured winds. A sketch of a clock that told time through the drip of melted wax. A drawing of a staircase that led nowhere, built only for the sake of climbing. Hephaestus smiled softly, not at the designs themselves, but at the freedom they had offered him once, when the act of imagining was more important than the act of forging. He gathered them carefully, tied them into a roll with a strip of faded linen, and placed them on the highest shelf above the table beneath a layer of untouched dust. They would remain there not to be rediscovered, but to rest. Moving to the corner, he retrieved a small bronze cup from a stone niche and filled it with lukewarm water drawn from a nearby jar, spring-fed and mineral-rich. He drank it slowly, letting each sip sit in his mouth before swallowing, as if tasting the mountain itself, the quiet of the rock, the stillness of roots. This water had never known haste. It traveled through the mountain like thought through sleep, and in it, he tasted silence. Setting the cup down, he walked toward the center of the chamber, where the fire had now receded to a faint halo around the core embers, the shadows of its light dancing low and long across the floor. Hephaestus knelt before it, not in reverence, but in recognition, and placed a single piece of scrap metal into the coals, not to melt, not to forge, but simply to let it join the warmth. The piece, a twisted strand of copper no longer fit for precision, glowed faintly, then settled in among the others that had long ago become part of the hearth's memory. Around the forge, silence deepened further, not as absence, but as fullness. He stood slowly, letting the warmth rise up his arms over his shoulders into his spine, and for a moment he saw the forge not just as stone and fire, but as an extension of himself. A place that had learned how to breathe because he had taught it how to rest. Returning to his stool near the basin, he sat once more and leaned back, gaze upward, not looking for anything in particular. The ceiling was hidden in dimness, but he knew it by heart. The curve of the dome, the vent above, the fine cracks like veins of silver that spread across its surface. And beneath it he sat, as he had for centuries, as he would for centuries more, not to build, not to shape, not to serve, but simply to be. The forge was not asking. The night was not ending. And so he remained, perfectly still, utterly present, warmed by flame, cooled by stone, watched only by shadows that had always known how to keep secrets. The forge, like a slow heartbeat echoing in stone, had by now sunk into its deepest quiet, a hush so complete it felt as though even time had paused outside its heavy doors, unwilling to intrude. Nothing stirred unless invited. No flame danced unless given breath. No tool clinked or fell from its place upon the wall. This was the final hour before sleep, or perhaps something gentler, a surrender not to slumber but to rest without demand. Hephaestus sat on the cool floor, back against a column that supported a ceiling no longer visible through the soft dusk of firelight and memory. His eyes were half closed, his hands resting lightly on his thighs, and his breathing was so measured, it seemed to sync with the low glow of the forge itself. He wasn't meditating, not in the way gods were often imagined to do. He was simply allowing himself to be, a presence among objects that no longer required his intervention. Nearby, the basin reflected nothing but stillness, its surface unbroken by even the faintest ripple. The automaton sat exactly where it always had, its limbs folded, its eyes dark but not lifeless, a quiet companion whose value had never depended on movement. Around the room, the remnants of uncountable centuries watched in silence. Unfinished projects, unclaimed ideas, worn-out tools, all of them part of the sacred tapestry that only the forge and its maker could fully understand. Hephaestus turned his head toward a shelf set low along the western wall, one that held items too small and strange for any god to request. The bell from a long-lost collar, a tiny hinge too delicate to carry weight, a ring of iron with no stone and no name. These were the things mortals had once left at the threshold of his caves, humble offerings made not in worship but in hope. Hope that a broken mechanism might be made whole again, that a lost piece might be replaced, or that simply leaving something behind would earn them some small blessing in return. He had never responded in thunder or light, but sometimes quietly, those pieces would disappear overnight, taken, examined, perhaps repaired, or perhaps simply accepted as enough. Now looking at them once more, Hephaestus felt a warmth that had nothing to do with flame. These were not treasures, they were truths, proof that what was made need not be mighty to be meaningful. He stood slowly and crossed to the shelf, his footsteps soft against the soot-darkened floor, and picked up the small hinge. Turning it between his fingers, he admired its simplicity. No ornament, no grandeur, just function, and the earnest desire to hold something together. He set it down carefully and turned away, walking slowly past the rack of cooling rods and the low bench lined with cloth-wrapped tools, each one sleeping as soundly as the forge itself. He paused at the large stone slab that had served as a shaping table longer than any memory could recall. Its surface bore grooves, burns, and faint etchings from thousands of tasks, evidence of work done in silence and work never started. He reached out and ran a hand across its surface, feeling every indentation like the wrinkles on an old friend's face. Then, with a quiet exhale, he sat at its edge, palms resting beside him, his back straight but unburdened. This was not a moment of anticipation. Nothing would follow it. No hammer would be lifted. No bellows pulled. This was a moment of belonging. The forge did not need fire now to affirm its purpose. It existed as a memory made real, and in its warmth, Hephaestus found the rarest kind of peace. A peace earned not through triumph but through persistence, presence, and the humble acceptance of stillness. A breeze so faint it could have been imagined moved through the high vent above, carrying with it the dry scent of stone dust and the distant song of some unseen world beyond the cave. Hephaestus did not look up. He only smiled, the expression, small and soft, barely moving the corners of his mouth. Around him the shadows lengthened one last time, gathering not as omens, but as blankets, wrapping around the benches, the walls, the sleeping machines, and as he closed his eyes, not to dream but to rest, the forge dimmed further still, drawing its warmth inward, protecting its quiet heart until the time for stillness had passed. But that time was not yet. Not tonight. Not while the god of craft remained breathing softly in his sanctuary of slow hours, where even forgotten pieces could find their place, and where nothing, absolutely nothing, was ever truly broken. The final moments of this long, quiet vigil unfolded not with ceremony, but with the gentlest surrender to stillness, the kind that does not announce itself, but simply arrives and is accepted, like twilight settling over a familiar landscape. The forge was no longer a place defined by fire or labor, but by presence, history, and the slow breath of memory that warmed its every wall. The flames had dwindled into their softest form, barely visible but still alive, like the pulse beneath, the wrist of someone at rest. The heat no longer radiated with urgency but with reassurance. Each tool, each object, each shadow had found its place for the night, and none sought more. Hephaestus sat once again at the low stone ledge beside the cooling hearth, his shoulders relaxed, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his gaze unfocused yet full of understanding. Around him the space hummed, not in sound but in sensation, a quiet affirmation that everything was exactly as it should be. He looked slowly around at the details he had seen 1,000 times and would see 1,000 more. The grooves in, the work tables worn into soft valleys by centuries of steady hands, the shelves lined with scraps and relics, each bearing a forgotten purpose now made sacred by time. The basin whose water no longer steamed but remained warm, reflecting not firelight but the gentle curve of stone above. He leaned forward and dipped his fingers into that water one final time, not to cool them, but to mark the moment, like a seal impressed into soft wax, acknowledging the closing of one long, beautiful hour. Behind him, the automaton remained. Unchanged, its limbs folded in eternal patience, its eyes dim but ever present. It would not wake. It didn't need to. Its purpose tonight was not to function, but to witness. Even the air had thickened into something close to silence, as if sound itself had curled up in a corner to rest. Hephaestus rose slowly, his joints, creaking not with age but with the deep echo of stillness shared between body and place. He walked toward the central chamber one last time, passing the ash-covered rack where forgotten tools lay side by side like friends in slumber. At the center of the forge stood a single unmarked stone, a pedestal of sorts, not for worship but for balance. He placed both hands on it, closed his eyes, and let his breath synchronize with the rhythm of the forge. He could feel it, not the fire, but the life of the place, the long memory embedded in each surface, each grain of soot, each cooled ember. The forge remembered every creation, every pause, every unspoken thought left lingering in the air. And in turn, it held him, gently now like the oldest friend in the world, asking nothing, offering only peace. He stepped away and turned once more toward the doorway carved into the far end of the chamber, the one that led not out, but deeper in, toward smaller rooms where other fires had burned, where quieter work had been done. He would not go there, tonight. That part of the forge could wait. He walked instead to the place where the wall curved gently inward, forming a hollow that caught the last of the light and held it like a memory cupped in a hand. He sat there, knees drawn slightly, up, arms resting loosely, and let his head tilt back against the stone. The curve of the wall fit him perfectly. He closed his eyes and listened to the forge breathe, to the whisper of warm stone settling, to the almost imperceptible crackle of the final ember giving itself over to the dark. And in that moment, time itself seemed to hold still, not stopped, not broken, but simply quieted, soothed, made soft. No gods called for weapons, no mortals cried out for miracles, no hammer needed lifting. All was well, all was enough. In the warm embrace of a forge that had seen every storm and survived them all, Hephaestus let the last thread of wakefulness drift away, leaving behind only the glow of stillness, the weight of quiet, and the peace of a work well rested. And, there in the heart of fire, stone, and timeless memory he slept, not as a god, not as a maker, but as one who had finally remembered how to be still.